Welcome to the world of darkness where nightmares inhabit your dreams. I've noticed YouTube's algorithm hides my stories. Your interaction is the only way to reach new listeners. If these stories frighten you, please like, subscribe, and activate notifications. Any comment, however brief, helps spread my stories to other horror fans. Now relax, close your eyes, and let the rain wash away your thoughts as I guide you through tonight's terrifying tale. The incident that nearly claimed my life occurred in the dense forests of Washington state. I was 17 years old at the time, young and foolishly confident in my understanding of the natural world. This happened back in 2018, though the memories remain as vivid as yesterday's sunrise. I was visiting my grandparents for what we called my summer staycation, a tradition spanning back to my childhood. I was born and raised in Washington in the small town of Newport near the Idaho border. My grandparents lived south of us in an even smaller community, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests north of Spokane. When I turned 8, my parents relocated our family to Newport Beach, California. Yes, from Newport to Newport Beach, a coincidence that became our family's running joke. Unlike my siblings who embraced coastal living, I yearned for the rugged wilderness of my birthplace. The ocean was beautiful, but it couldn't replace the towering pines and hidden valleys of rural Washington. So each summer, while my siblings lounged on sandy beaches, I returned to my grandparents' farm. Their property was substantial, 297 acres of diverse terrain that sustained multiple crops and livestock. 60 acres were dedicated to alfalfa, another 47 to commercial dent corn, 70 for Gala apple orchards, and 30 for Vidalia onions. They also raised about 400 sheep and 7 cows that roamed the remaining acreage of forested hills and rocky terrain. The livestock served multiple purposes, with sheep grazing beneath apple trees, keeping vegetation manageable while feasting on fallen fruit. When curious neighbors asked why my grandparents diversified their farming operations, their explanation was straightforward. Experience had taught them harsh lessons about agricultural vulnerability. A single disastrous potato season had nearly bankrupted them decades earlier, and they swore never to depend on a single crop again. My education on the farm grew more advanced with each passing summer. My grandparents patiently taught me to operate increasingly complex equipment tractors, harvesters, and utility vehicles that traversed the varied landscape. The exhilaration of driving tractors and ATVs across open fields became the highlight of my visits. Though most planting concluded before my arrival, there was never a shortage of tasks. By midsummer, we'd harvest the first alfalfa cutting, and I'd work through the night, watching nocturnal wildlife emerge from forest edges to investigate our mechanical intrusion. The farm's boundaries touched wilderness, and I grew accustomed to seeing deer, elk, moose, and occasionally predators like mountain lions or bears. Wolves maintained a ghostly presence, their howls echoing through valleys while their physical forms remained elusive shadows glimpsed at great distances. Beyond my grandparents, about 10 seasonal workers helped manage the farm's operations. These men knew the land intimately, having worked it for years. Yet for all my familiarity with local wildlife, there remained gaps in my knowledge. The surrounding communities occasionally referenced cryptids with skepticism, or as fodder for campfire stories told to frighten teenagers. Bigfoot received occasional mention, though always with a knowing wink or dismissive laugh. The wilderness held secrets, certainly, but none we believed could truly threaten us. The summer of 2018 marked a significant transition in my life. After years of pleading, my parents finally relented to my request to complete my senior year in Washington. The prospect of returning permanently filled me with excitement, though I couldn't have imagined the horror awaiting me before the school year would begin. Agricultural life follows natural rhythms dictated by crop cycles. Alfalfa requires multiple cuttings throughout the season. Corn harvest depends on moisture content, typically occurring between September and late October. Onions come out of the ground in late August through early September. Apple harvest proves most labor-intensive, requiring both mechanical assistance and significant human effort. My grandparents hired local high school students during this period, paying by the bushel to incentivize efficient work. It was during this transitional period between apple and corn harvest when the incident occurred. The day began unremarkably. The eastern sky barely showed hints of dawn when one of the workers discovered the damaged fence near the apple orchard's eastern boundary. A substantial section had been knocked down, not cut or broken by normal wear, but forcefully collapsed as though something massive had pushed through. More concerning than the structural damage was the livestock situation. Most of the sheep had wandered beyond the property line. My grandfather gathered several workers and me to track down the animals before they dispersed completely. We quickly retrieved our ATVs from the equipment shed and set out in search patterns. "Keep your eyes on the ground," my grandfather instructed, his weathered face creased with concern. "Look for hoof prints, droppings, or wool caught on branches. They couldn't have gone too far since last night's check." Several friends joined the search, and we worked systematically through the morning hours. By mid-afternoon, we had located and returned most of the flock, leaving only 6 unaccounted for. My friends needed to leave for other commitments, but my grandfather pulled me aside before I could join them. "We need those last 6 back before nightfall," he said firmly. "Predators get bold after dark, and those sheep represent a significant investment." I nodded, understanding both the financial and ethical responsibility of protecting the animals in our care. After grabbing a quick meal, I headed back out alone, this time taking the 3-wheeler since all 4-wheelers were occupied with apple trailer transportation. The older 3-wheeler held a special place in my heart, despite its mechanical quirks. Unlike newer models with built-in speed governors, this machine could achieve impressive velocity across open terrain, though finding replacement parts proved increasingly difficult as the model aged. I directed my search toward the eastern property line, a rugged section dominated by forest and rocky hills near the Idaho border. The landscape there shifted dramatically from the cultivated fields, untamed and forbidding even in daylight. The southern and eastern boundaries consisted primarily of these unwelcoming features, making them the least desirable portions of the farm. Mental mapping placed the southern fence line as belonging to the neighboring property owned by the Rodriguez family. They cultivated wheat and alfalfa, their boundary continuing westward until it met Amish-owned farmland. The northern boundary followed a main access road shared by all adjacent properties. Beginning at the location where we'd recovered sheep earlier, I struggled to determine where the remaining animals might have wandered. Visibility proved limited from ground level, so I navigated to a hilltop for a better vantage point. The elevated position offered little additional insight, forcing me to think like a sheep, to consider which path would naturally appeal to the animals. The most logical route appeared to follow the hill's base, curving around toward an abandoned quarry. This presented a potential problem, as years of runoff had transformed the quarry into a marshy, unstable environment. I crossed the hilltop and halted my vehicle at the slope's edge, cutting the engine to listen for bleating or movement below. Standing at the precipice, I surveyed the landscape stretching before me. The exposed hillside featured scattered sagebrush and loose rocks, weathered by seasons of harsh elements. The rocky face displayed contrasting colors, predominantly reddish with occasional streaks of gray where erosion had cut deeper. As evening light faded, the entire scene took on an increasingly sinister appearance. I checked my watch. 7:47 p.m. Sunset approached rapidly, and twilight would soon surrender to darkness. Logic dictated returning to the farmhouse and resuming the search with proper lighting and assistance. Yet adolescent impulse overrode better judgment. Before departing, I decided to entertain myself by rolling stones down the incline. I located several basketball-sized rocks nearby and sent them tumbling, watching as they dislodged smaller shale in their path. The minor avalanches proved less spectacular than anticipated, prompting me to seek a more substantial challenge. My attention fixed on a boulder roughly equivalent to my three-wheeler's size. Initial attempts to dislodge it proved futile, as the rock remained stubbornly embedded in surrounding soil. Needing additional leverage, I climbed uphill to snap a sturdy branch from a nearby tree. Returning to the boulder, I heard distant bleating, faint but unmistakable sheep vocalizations carrying across the stagnant air. The sounds appeared to originate from beyond the marsh, confirming my suspicions about their location while highlighting the difficult terrain separating us. Unable to navigate the treacherous landscape with my vehicle, I decided to complete my rock-rolling experiment before retrieving a truck better suited for the recovery operation. I wedged the branch beneath the boulder at various angles, gradually increasing pressure until the massive stone tilted and broke free. The rock's descent exceeded my expectations, thundering downslope with increasing momentum, while triggering a cascade of smaller debris in its wake. The landslide generated surprising volume, echoing across the valley. As the boulder approached the bottom, something unexpected caught my attention. A dark shape darting away from the impact zone through settling dust. I dismissed it as wildlife startled by the disturbance, likely a coyote or fox seeking evening prey. When the final stone settled at the hill's base, I returned to my three-wheeler, preparing to depart. The sheep called out again, presumably alarmed by the commotion. I turned toward the sound and shouted reassuringly, "I'll be right back," while reaching for the kickstart. Before I could engage the engine, peripheral movement registered, a grayish mass accelerating toward me with frightening velocity. Impact came without warning or opportunity for evasion. The collision launched me from the vehicle with devastating force. One moment I stood firmly on solid ground, the next, reality inverted as I tumbled uncontrollably down the jagged incline. My body became entangled with something massive, its matted fur brushing against my face during our violent descent. Each rotation brought fresh agony as the sloped surface tore through my clothing. The initial impacts punctured my flannel shirt, exposing skin to abrasive rocks that carved shallow wounds across my back. Air evacuated my lungs upon first impact, leaving me gasping desperately between collisions. The entity responsible for my predicament continued rolling alongside me, its substantial mass inflicting additional damage with each point of contact. Its body radiated unnatural density and heat, while the stench of decay permeated my senses. I perceived its bulk absorbing punishment that would have otherwise shattered my bones. Sudden, stabbing pain erupted near my waist, something sharp penetrating fabric and breaking skin. The sensation registered as claws or talons, though my mind couldn't fully process the implications as survival instinct overrode analytical thought. My descent halted with jarring abruptness as something snagged my clothing. The creature continued its downward trajectory, its substantial form tumbling beyond my position. Disoriented and trembling, I identified the intervention. A sagebrush had become entangled in my belt, arresting my momentum at a crucial moment. Below me, the unseen assailant emitted distressed vocalizations, a combination of whining and guttural noises suggesting injury. I loosened my belt to free myself from the brush, attempting to stand despite the unstable surface. My legs refused proper coordination, nerves firing erratically from shock and trauma. Small rocks embedded themselves in my knees through torn denim as I attempted crawling across the treacherous slope. Army crawling proved marginally effective, allowing incremental progress across the hillside. What felt like hours of desperate movement eventually brought me to more stable terrain where standing became possible. I scrambled toward my overturned three-wheeler, discovering gasoline leaking from the vent hole in its cap. With practiced movements born from years of experience, I righted the machine using the handlebar and rear fender as leverage points. The engine had undoubtedly flooded during the accident, requiring careful handling to avoid further complications. I held the throttle open while allowing fuel to settle properly, a necessary delay despite my desperate circumstances. During this forced pause, sounds from below captured my attention. My attacker remained alive, struggling to ascend the slope while emitting unnatural growls. The vocalizations carried qualities I couldn't reconcile with known wildlife, neither fully canine nor ursine, but something disturbingly between. What kind of creature wouldn't give up after that? I whispered, straining to identify the shape in growing darkness. The silhouette suggested badger-like proportions, but at an impossible scale, or perhaps a wolverine of unprecedented size. Another possibility crossed my mind, a wild boar, though the movement patterns contradicted this theory. The growls continued, blending whining with threatening snarls in an unsettling combination. Abandoning further speculation, I focused on escape. The engine finally responded to my kick, purring to life as I opened the throttle fully. Before accelerating away, I glanced backward once more and discovered the slope empty of my pursuer. Scanning frantically, I spotted movement through the marsh. A dark figure zigzagging with unnatural speed through difficult terrain. The realization struck with horrifying clarity. The creature hadn't abandoned its hunt, but was executing a flanking maneuver to intercept me. I launched the three-wheeler forward, heart hammering against my ribcage as I pushed the machine to its limits. Wind howled past my ears while I maintained approximately 40 miles per hour across uneven ground. The tree line approached rapidly, forcing me to reduce speed just enough to navigate between trunks. Turning northward toward familiar trails, I glimpsed my pursuer through peripheral vision, a dark shape moving parallel to my course, matching my pace between trees. Panic surged through my system, prompting me to veer southward, while crouching low over the handlebars to minimize wind resistance. My front tire struck an unseen obstacle, violently jarring the steering column and momentarily lifting the wheel before slamming it down. The impact loosened the headlight bulb, causing it to flicker erratically like a primitive strobe, casting disorienting, intermittent illumination through the forest. Through these pulsing glimpses, I witnessed the creature darting alongside my path, its speed defying biological limitations. The forest thinned ahead, revealing open hillside, a potential advantage for my vehicle's superior straight-line velocity. Before I could capitalize on this opportunity, violent impact from my right sent the three-wheeler skidding sideways as though struck by another vehicle. Fighting for control, I barely stabilized when a second, more powerful collision spun me completely around. Instinctively engaging the brakes caused the engine to stall, plunging me into profound silence. The abrupt transition from mechanical roar to absolute quiet intensified my terror. Physical manifestations of fear overwhelmed my system, hair bristling against my sleeves, hands shaking uncontrollably, jaw muscles spasming beyond voluntary control. Then the creature materialized before my vehicle, its massive form blocking escape. In the moonlight's pale illumination, I finally observed my pursuer clearly. Initial Wolverine comparisons proved woefully inadequate. The entity resembled nothing from conventional zoology, its proportions and features suggesting something that shouldn't exist outside horror cinema. It growled with such profound bass that vibrations transmitted through my seat. When it turned toward me, eyes reflecting orange hatred in the darkness, my terror reached previously unimagined heights. Then, impossibly, it rose to stand on two legs, revealing a bipedal form that demolished any remaining rational explanations. Involuntarily retreating, I tumbled backward off the three-wheeler. The creature dropped to all fours and circled my vehicle with predatory intent. Survival instinct triggered desperate flight, despite knowing outrunning it was impossible. I managed barely 3 steps before tripping and falling face first into dirt. Then came the most terrifying sensation: fingers, actual fingers, wrapping around my left ankle with crushing pressure. Twisting to face my attacker, I witnessed the creature extending its reach without fully committing to pursuit, pulling me inexorably toward its waiting jaws. Something within me transformed, panic crystallizing into desperate rage. "You want to eat me?" I screamed, kicking wildly with my free leg while clawing at the ground for purchase. Its mouth gaped open, revealing dentition resembling an oversized canine predator. As my foot approached its jaws, I redirected my efforts toward striking its head repeatedly with my free limb. My blows seemed ineffective, serving only to intensify its growling. Tears streamed down my face as sobs escaped between screams, the hopelessness of my situation becoming painfully apparent. My fingers encountered a fist-sized rock embedded in soil, the only potential weapon within reach. Grasping the stone, I leaned forward with every ounce of remaining strength and struck the creature's nose with maximum force. Before it could react, I jammed the rock directly into one eye socket. The response was immediate, a high-pitched yip followed by release of my leg as it recoiled to paw at its injured face. Seizing this momentary advantage, I rolled aside and scrambled to my feet in a single fluid motion. I leaped onto the three-wheeler, kick-started the engine, and accelerated away without concern for direction or terrain. The southern fence line appeared in the distance, providing crucial orientation as I maintained parallel course through sagebrush and around larger obstacles. Engine noise obscured environmental sounds, but building structures gradually materialized ahead, the old Rodriguez barn approaching through darkness. As hope kindled within me, an inhuman roar shattered my composure, the sound reverberating through my body with physically painful intensity. The three-wheeler began jerking violently beneath me. Glancing downward revealed my pursuer's hands gripping both tires, claws penetrating rubber with evident ease. Air escaped with audible hissing as the tires deflated. Despite revving the engine aggressively, my speed continued decreasing. The creature momentarily lost balance, providing precious seconds as I limped forward on damaged wheels. The speedometer indicated a mere 15 miles per hour as I approached the barn. Pushing the dying machine to 20, I coasted into the clearing between grain silos and the weathered structure. Before the vehicle fully stopped, I abandoned it and sprinted toward the barn's entrance, throwing my weight against the heavy door and slipping inside. Frantic fingers traced wooden surfaces in near-complete darkness, desperately seeking security. I located a familiar groove that housed a metal crossbar, sliding it firmly into position across the door. Testing the barrier with substantial pressure confirmed it would hold, at least temporarily. Overwhelming relief flooded my system as I collapsed onto the dirt floor, my body trembling uncontrollably from exertion and terror. Outside, my three-wheeler continued idling, its headlight casting erratic pulses through barred window openings resembling feeding pens. The intermittent illumination allowed brief orientation within the structure. I recognized the layout from previous visits years earlier, when my grandfather and I had traded hay for livestock with the Rodriguez family. The rectangular building featured central walkways flanked by stalls, with elevated hay storage accessible via ladder. Barred windows perforated exterior walls at regular intervals, allowing ventilation while preventing livestock escape or predator entry. The physical security momentarily calmed my racing thoughts until reality reasserted itself through sound. Heavy footsteps circled outside, accompanied by deep rhythmic breathing that exceeded normal wildlife lung capacity. Metal creaked, my three-wheeler's frame protesting as something manipulated it. The engine's pitch fluctuated before the machine sailed through air, tumbling end over end like a discarded toy. After a final mechanical sputter, silence descended. In darkness, now absolute, my eyes strained uselessly toward each window. Anticipation built unbearably until impact shook the entire structure, a deliberate ramming attempt against the wall. Another followed, then another, each from different positions as the creature systematically tested structural integrity. After multiple unsuccessful attempts, the assaults ceased. A new sound emerged, claws methodically dragging across exterior surfaces, occasionally catching on barred windows with metallic pinging. The deliberate nature of these actions suggested disturbing intelligence. The scratching halted abruptly near my position. Despite complete darkness, I sensed its precise location through inexplicable awareness. A low snarl preceded arms reaching through bars, fingers extending inward like grotesque probes seeking contact. The creature grasped metal barriers and jerked violently, testing their anchoring. Though the bars held against initial assault, continuous pressure produced an ominous metallic whine, suggesting imminent failure. When the creature paused its efforts, the silence proved more terrifying than its previous aggression. Was it planning? Calculating? The methodical clicking of nails against metal preceded a hideous, prolonged whine before the presence withdrew. Minutes stretched interminably without further sound. I consulted my watch. Barely an hour had passed since my rock-rolling experiment, though subjective experience suggested vastly longer duration. Surely my grandparents would initiate search efforts soon, though this thought offered minimal comfort given my current circumstances. Wood splintering interrupted my thoughts. Not the door, but somewhere along the wall. Scratching and growling followed as the creature apparently discovered a structural weakness. Moving stall to stall in near darkness, I frantically searched for defensive implements. In one windowless enclosure, heavy breathing and scratching intensified. The predator had located a small knothole and forced its snout through the opening. Continuing my desperate inventory, I remembered my grandfather's practice of storing larger tools in overhead rafters. Looking upward, I distinguished the silhouettes of a shovel and pitchfork suspended above an adjacent stall. I quickly retrieved both and returned to confront my stalker. It had withdrawn momentarily, but immediately reinserted its muzzle upon detecting my presence. Gathering courage, I raised the pitchfork and drove it downward with maximum force against the exposed nose. The implement's tines encountered surprising resistance, failing to penetrate fully despite my desperate strength. The creature withdrew violently, slamming against the exterior wall with sufficient force to flex the entire structure without breaking through. Retreating from the stall, I observed the creature attempting to force its entire head through barred windows. Its skull barely fit between metal barriers, becoming temporarily wedged in the process. Seizing this opportunity, I grabbed the shovel and struck its exposed head with all available strength. The impact produced a resonant metallic sound, but minimal apparent injury. As the creature roared and struggled to free itself, I noticed the architectural detail that might provide advantage. Wooden shutters suspended above each window, held open by simple hook-and-eye mechanisms. Using the shovel handle, I dislodged the hook holding the nearest shutter. The heavy wooden panel crashed downward, striking the creature's skull with devastating force and dislodging it from between bars. A tremendous impact followed as the creature slammed against the exterior wall, momentarily stunned, but evidently not incapacitated. I hurried to secure remaining windows, dropping each protective shutter into position. In resulting darkness, the creature's rage manifested through intensified growling and renewed assault against the main entrance. Metal hinges protested against repeated impacts, their distressed tones suggesting imminent failure. Strange sounds followed, heavy objects dropping onto ground followed by shuffling movements. Curiosity overcame caution as I peered through a small gap between door panels. The creature's silhouette appeared in moonlight, apparently leaping upward repeatedly. Realization struck with horrifying clarity. It targeted the hayloft entrance, attempting to reach the pulley rope hanging from the exterior loading mechanism. Navigating through darkness toward the interior ladder, I ascended to the loft level and pushed open the access panel. Moonlight flooded the elevated space, providing significantly better visibility than the ground floor. Approaching the exterior loading door cautiously, I observed the creature's repeated attempts to capture the dangling rope. It paused, sniffing air currents before looking directly at my position with uncanny accuracy. Backing up for better visual perspective, it suddenly dropped to all fours and charged forward, leaping with extraordinary height. Its snout contacted the rope, causing it to swing pendulously. Before the predator could capitalize on this success, I lunged forward and grabbed the rope, pulling the entire pulley assembly inside. The creature responded with an enraged vocalization that penetrated my core with primordial fear. Despite overwhelming terror, anger ignited within me, a desperate determination to survive this inexplicable nightmare. Surveying available resources, I noticed several large hay bales positioned near the track system used for moving loads throughout the loft. An idea formed, perhaps not tactically sound, but born from limited options and mounting desperation. I connected the largest bale to the track using tines and block-and-tackle mechanisms, positioning it beneath the exterior hood. My plan involved swinging the massive bale outward and dropping it onto my pursuer, but the assembly's reach proved insufficient to position it properly. Lowering the bale partially, I hoped to entice the creature beneath it. Initially, the strategy appeared ineffective as the predator retreated from the suspended load. Suddenly, violent oscillations transmitted through the rope as unexpected weight pulled against my grip. Arms appeared around the bale's perimeter. The creature had leaped upward and latched onto the suspended mass. Before it could establish stable position, I released tension completely, sending both bale and beast plummeting earthward. The impact resonated through the barn's structure, a substantial thud suggesting significant force. From my elevated position, I observed no movement beneath the collapsed bale, though uncertainty remained about the creature's condition. Self-preservation prevented immediate departure, as the risk of encountering the potentially conscious predator outweighed potential escape. Looking around the loft, I identified multiple hay bales that could provide temporary shelter. Using the track system, I relocated all available bales to form a barricade across the loft opening, effectively sealing myself inside. Climbing atop the improvised fortress, I burrowed slightly downward into decomposing hay that emitted musty odors from previous moisture exposure. The aging material might mask my scent, I reasoned, while providing concealment from visual detection. Covered completely and remaining motionless, exhaustion eventually overcame hypervigilance, and unconsciousness claimed me. I awakened to faint sniffing sounds and distant rustling. Paralysis gripped me momentarily as recent events reassembled in my consciousness. Summoning tremendous willpower to move incrementally, I checked my watch, 6:07 a.m. Nearly 8 hours had passed since the initial encounter. The rustling continued rhythmically, interspersed with shallow sniffing followed by muffled sneezing. Terror resurged with crushing intensity. Forcing myself to action, I slowly rotated and crawled toward the bale's edge, dreading the possibility of making direct eye contact with the creature. Initial inspection revealed nothing below. Methodically checking each direction yielded similar results. The sounds continued, however, reminiscent of sheep nosing through hay during feeding times. A horrifying possibility materialized. Perhaps the creature had somehow accessed the loft's edge and was systematically excavating my hiding place. Lowering my head near the bale's surface, I confirmed the sounds originated nearby. Trembling intensified as another sneeze punctuated the rustling. Gradually rising to kneeling position in preparation for desperate flight, I remained hyper-aware of increasing activity below. Without warning, a head emerged from the bottom hay bale directly before me. It twisted erratically, struggling to orient itself while emitting a low, menacing growl. Acting purely on instinct, I leaped downward, landing directly on its exposed skull and snout. The creature emitted an agonized sound unlike anything in nature's repertoire. The impact destabilized me, resulting in forward momentum that positioned me directly before the predator. Its head shook violently, dislodging surrounding hay that cascaded downward like geological slides. The entire barricade began shifting, individual bales elevating slightly before explosively dispersing as the creature burst upward, howling triumphantly. Before regaining my footing, I scrambled toward the loft access door, wrenching it open and sliding onto the ladder below. The hatch closed automatically as I descended rapidly, skipping multiple rungs in my haste. Above me, claws tore at wooden barriers while structural damage accelerated. The loft door suddenly collapsed, followed by substantial impact on the floor above. Turning toward the barn's main entrance, I witnessed the creature landing on the opposite side, immediately orienting toward my position. As it advanced, my fingers located the door latch and disengaged it. Squeezing through the narrowest possible opening, I slammed the heavy panel behind me and secured the exterior crossbar. The door immediately flexed outward as tremendous force applied from within, accompanied by frustrated vocalizations. After brief silence, renewed assault threatened the door's integrity, the barrier flexing outward substantially further than previous attempts. Recognizing imminent breakthrough, I sprinted around the structure, nearly colliding with my damaged three-wheeler. The nearest alternative shelter appeared to be the grain silos positioned nearby. The first two structures lacked external access ladders, but the third featured metal rungs ascending to its summit. As I reached the base and began climbing, the barn door crashed inward behind me. By the time I neared the ladder's midpoint, my pursuer had circled the silo's foundation, snarling with undiminished rage. It attempted climbing, but failed after minimal progress, nails scraping against metal surfaces as it slid downward. Continuing my ascent, I reached the small maintenance platform crowning the silo's dome. The elevated position prevented direct observation of the creature below, though its movements remained audible. Wind intensified at this height, chilling my sweat-soaked clothing uncomfortably. Consulting my watch again, nearly 6:30 a.m., with dawn approaching incrementally. Minutes stretched interminably before silence settled below. Cautiously returning to the silo's edge, I peered downward. The creature remained, having abandoned escape attempts in favor of patient waiting. Upon noticing my observation, it renewed climbing efforts with increased determination. I retreated to the platform center, contemplating entering the silo itself, but recognizing the potential trap this would create. Multiple failed climbing attempts continued until distant headlights appeared along the access road. Hope surged as I began jumping vigorously, attempting to attract attention. The approaching vehicle maintained direct course toward our position, engine sounds growing progressively louder as it navigated the uneven terrain. A pickup truck crested the hill, headlights illuminating the barn before continuing toward the silos. The vehicle belonged to Roberto Rodriguez, who approached cautiously before stopping. Below, the creature remained visible despite the truck's arrival, momentarily assessing this new development. The standoff extended several seconds before the driver's door swung open, and Roberto emerged holding a shotgun. He shouted commands in Spanish while bracing the weapon against the doorframe. The first shot struck the creature, sending fur flying from its massive form. It yipped sharply before turning toward this new threat. The distinctive pump-action sound preceded a second discharge, causing the creature to physically shudder and halt its advance. Two additional shots followed in rapid succession. Remarkably, after absorbing multiple blasts at close range, the creature turned and fled rather than continuing its attack. "Get down now," Roberto shouted. "It might return." I descended rapidly, jumping into the truck's cabin while Roberto handed me the shotgun. "Reload this," he instructed while starting the engine. He activated the CB radio, contacting my grandfather with miraculous efficiency. "William, I found him. Over." My grandfather's voice transmitted relief without proper radio protocol. "Thank God." "William," Roberto continued, "remember that thing I told you about years ago? It's back, and it had your grandson trapped on your old silos." "Over." "Just get back here," my grandfather responded. "Let me talk to my boy." "Over." Upon returning to the farm, emotional reunions consumed several minutes. The search party had formed later than optimal, departing only after 10 p.m. when my absence became concerning. One worker examined my injuries, stitching several deeper lacerations, while my grandfather organized a return expedition to the marsh area. Despite others' reservations, I insisted on accompanying them. At the quarry site, we discovered the sheep had vanished completely. We recovered them later that day, several miles from their initial location. More significantly, the portion of marsh adjacent to the rocky ledge had been completely transformed, buried beneath tons of rock from my inadvertent landslide. "There must be 2 truckloads of material here," one worker observed. Then, more ominously, "Looks like there were small caves underneath. Whatever lived down there probably wasn't happy about having its home destroyed." The implication settled heavily. I had inadvertently collapsed the creature's den, possibly burying others of its kind. If wolves operate in packs, why not these entities? The territory marking and relentless pursuit suddenly acquired contextual meaning, not random aggression, but territorial defense and retribution. I never encountered another such creature during subsequent years on the farm. My grandparents eventually retired, with my siblings and I initially maintaining operations before my parents assumed full management. The experience permanently altered my perception of wilderness and the natural world, not through diminished appreciation, but through humble recognition of its mysteries. There exist entities in remote regions that defy conventional classification, neither fully animal nor mythical, but dangerous realities rarely encountered and less frequently survived. I share this account not to perpetuate fear, but to encourage respect for wilderness boundaries and the understanding that humanity's knowledge remains profoundly incomplete. The letter arrived 3 months after my grandmother's funeral. Grandma Kaya had been the last of our family to maintain any connection to our Dena'ina heritage. When she passed, I thought that connection had died with her. "Dear Dakota," the letter began in her familiar shaky handwriting, "the cabin is yours now. I never told you much about our ancestral land because I wanted to protect you. But you're strong, stronger than I was. The cabin waits for you in the shadow of Denali. Go there, learn our ways. But be cautious when darkness falls." I read the letter again in my cramped Seattle apartment, surrounded by past due notices. 3 months behind on rent, student loans in default. The marketing agency I worked for had just announced another round of layoffs. The timing couldn't have been worse, or perhaps better. A cabin in Alaska, free housing, a chance to reconnect with my roots. Something called to me from those remote woods. 2 weeks later, I stood at the end of a gravel road, staring at the small wooden structure nestled among towering pines. The nearest neighbor was 7 miles away. Cell service was non-existent. The cabin itself was rustic but solid. One main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, and a surprisingly modern bathroom addition. That first night, as I unpacked my few belongings, I found Grandma Kaya's journal wedged between the wall logs. The earliest entry was dated 1978. "The elders warn that this land sits at the boundary between worlds," she had written. "Things walk here that should not be. They take forms familiar to trick us. Never answer if you hear your name called from the forest after sunset. Never follow animal tracks that suddenly become human footprints. The skinwalkers hunger for more than flesh." I laughed nervously, setting the journal aside. Grandma had always been superstitious, but as darkness fell completely, the forest seemed to press against the windows. The wind through the pines sounded almost like words, almost like my name. I locked the door, stoked the fire, and told myself these were just the normal sounds of wilderness. I was a city boy after all. These were just the sounds of my new home. It wasn't until I was drifting to sleep that I heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the porch, heavy, deliberate, stopping just outside my bedroom window. But when I gathered my courage to look, moonlight revealed only empty woods. The first few days at the cabin were peaceful. I spent my time making repairs, chopping firewood, and exploring the immediate surroundings. The forest was breathtaking, thick with spruce and hemlock, carpeted with moss and wild berries. Snow-capped mountains loomed on the horizon. Bald eagles soared overhead. The air was cleaner than anything I'd ever breathed. I began settling into a simple routine. Mornings by the creek collecting water and fishing. Afternoons maintaining the cabin or hiking nearby trails. Evenings by the fire reading more of Kaya's journals. I've seen it twice now, read an entry from 1986, standing at the edge of the clearing. It looks like a man but stands wrong. Too tall, joints bend backwards. When it thinks I'm not looking, it moves on all fours. Fast, faster than anything should move. I had dismissed such entries at first, but slowly a sense of unease grew within me. The forest was never truly silent, yet sometimes all sound would suddenly cease. Birds, insects, wind, everything would go still. During these moments, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. On my 5th day, I ventured farther than before, following an overgrown trail that led to a small meadow. In the center stood a circle of stones. They weren't natural formations. Someone had arranged them deliberately. Each stone was marked with faded symbols that resembled those in Kaya's journal. As I knelt to examine them, I noticed something unsettling. Around the circle, the grass was bent away as if something had been circling the stones repeatedly. The tracks were fresh. The silence hit suddenly. Not even my own breathing seemed to make a sound. The hairs on my neck stood up as I felt eyes boring into me from the tree line behind. I turned slowly. Nothing visible moved among the trees, but I knew with absolute certainty, that something was there, watching, waiting. I backed away, maintaining eye contact with the empty forest. The rational part of my mind argued I was being ridiculous, but some deeper instinct screamed for caution. Just as I reached the trail, a sound broke the silence, a low, rattling breath that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I ran, not stopping until I reached the cabin. That night, I pored over Kaya's journals with new urgency. One passage made my blood run cold. The stone circle is an ancient boundary. Our ancestors placed it there as a warning. Do not cross. Do not disturb. Those who venture beyond invite the watchers into our world. I realized too late that I might have done exactly that. Outside, something scratched at the walls of the cabin. Something that periodically let out sounds almost, but not quite, like human speech. The scratching continued intermittently through the night. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just branches against the siding, perhaps a curious raccoon. But when I circled the cabin after sunrise, I found long gouges in the wood. They started at ground level and reached higher than I could touch. Some formed patterns that looked disturbingly like letters in an alphabet I didn't recognize. I spent that day reinforcing the cabin, checking window locks, barricading the rear door, and gathering anything that could serve as a weapon. I found an old shotgun mounted above the fireplace, but no ammunition. Still, its weight provided some comfort. As dusk approached, I built the fire higher than necessary. The warmth and light created an illusion of safety I desperately needed. I continued reading through Kaya's journals, searching for any information that might help me understand what was happening. October 1991. Tusky came to the door today. I almost let him in before remembering Tusky died 3 summers ago. It wore his face perfectly, even had his crooked smile. But the eyes were wrong, flat and hungry. I kept the door closed and prayed until morning. Found deer carcasses scattered around the property. They'd been turned inside out, organs arranged in circles. My skin crawled. Something deep in my genetic memory resonated with these stories. The legends I'd dismissed as superstition suddenly felt vivid and possible in this ancient wilderness. Night fell completely. The forest seemed to swell with darkness, pressing against the windows. Then I heard it, a voice just outside. "Takoda, are you there? It's me." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It sounded exactly like my ex-girlfriend Mina. the same voice that had once meant safety and comfort. "Dakota, please. I'm lost and scared. I came to find you. Let me in." I froze, heart pounding. Mina was in Portland. She had no way of knowing where I was. No reason to be in the Alaskan wilderness at night. "Please, I'm so cold. I can see you through the window." I looked toward the window and nearly screamed. A face was pressed against the glass. It resembled Mina. Her high cheekbones, her dark hair. But the proportions were subtly wrong. The eyes were too wide. The smile stretched too far across the face. As I watched in horror, the face began to shift and change, features rearranging like clay. One moment, it looked like Mina, then my mother, then Grandma Kaya, then people I didn't recognize, all wearing the same hungry expression. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The thing at the window made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a growl, and began tapping on the glass with impossibly long fingers. Tap, tap, tap. I retreated to the fireplace, grabbing the empty shotgun and pointing it at the window. The face withdrew, but I could hear movement all around the cabin now. Multiple sets of footsteps circling, sometimes bipedal, sometimes sounding like something on all fours moving at terrifying speed. That night, I did not sleep. I sat by the fire, weapon in hand, listening to the things outside call my name in voices I had once loved. Dawn brought merciful silence. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed to retreat with the darkness. I ventured outside only long enough to gather more firewood, keeping the cabin in sight at all times. In the daylight, I discovered dozens of different footprints in the soft earth around my home, some human, some animal, and some a disturbing combination of both. Back inside, I barricaded myself again and returned to Kaya's journals with renewed desperation. I needed to understand what I was facing. One entry from the late 1990s provided the first real clue. They are called many names by many tribes. Our people called them Nantina, the ones who change. The white settlers later called them skinwalkers. They were once human, medicine people who gave up their humanity for power. Now they exist between worlds, wearing skins not their own. They feed on fear first, flesh second. Another passage, written more recently, gave specific instructions. To survive the skinwalker, never show fear, they smell it. Never invite them in. They cannot enter without permission. Never trust your eyes or ears. They mimic what you love most. The circle of protection must be maintained with sage smoke and prayers at each season change. I have neglected this duty. I pray Dakota never pays for my mistake. I realized then that Kaya had been trying to protect me by keeping me away from this place. But she must have known eventually I would come. Why else leave me the cabin? Perhaps she believed I could do what she could not, restore the protections and drive these things back. At the back of her final journal, I found loose pages with prayers written in both English and Dena'ina. Diagrams showed how to arrange protective symbols. A map marked sacred sites around the property, including the stone circle I had found. I spent the day preparing. I found Kaya's stored sage and cedar. I located the items needed for the protection ritual: a knife with a bone handle, a pouch of red ochre, strands of horsehair. As the sun began its descent, I steeled myself for what needed to be done. According to the journal, I would need to visit each sacred site and renew the markings before returning to the stone circle at midnight. The final ritual would need to be performed under the open sky, exposed and vulnerable. Just before sunset, I saw it for the first time in full daylight. Standing at the forest's edge, a figure too tall, too thin to be human. Its limbs hung at impossible angles. Its face was featureless, except for dark hollows where eyes should be. When it noticed me watching, it tilted its head at an unnatural angle, then dropped to all fours and scuttled into the underbrush with frightening speed. Night was coming. I had little time. The journals had warned. They were stronger in darkness, and this night would be moonless. I gathered my supplies, said a prayer I barely remembered from childhood, and stepped outside to face what waited in the gathering shadows. The fading light painted long shadows between the trees as I set out with my backpack of ritual supplies. According to Kaya's map, there were 4 sacred sites that formed a protective boundary around the property. I needed to visit each one before midnight, then perform the final ritual at the stone circle. The first site was a lightning-struck pine about a quarter-mile east of the cabin. Its trunk was split down the middle, creating a natural doorway. Following the journal's instructions, I mixed ochre with water from the creek and painted renewal symbols on the exposed heartwood. As I finished the final stroke, the forest went silent around me. That same weighted presence I'd felt before pressed down from all sides. Something moved just beyond my peripheral vision. I refused to look directly at it, remembering Kaya's warning that eye contact was a form of invitation. Instead, I burned a small bundle of sage, letting the smoke drift through the split trunk while reciting the prayer from the journal. I stand at the threshold between worlds. I renew the ancient boundary. What walks between cannot pass. The presence receded slightly. 1 site complete, 3 to go. The second marker was a natural spring that bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. Here, I tied strands of horsehair across the water's source, then planted cedar bundles at the cardinal points. Again, I felt that watching presence, closer this time. From the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of elongated limbs moving between distant trees. The third site was the most difficult, a small cave entrance halfway up a rocky hillside. Inside, ancient handprints covered the walls. Some were human-sized. Others were disturbingly large, with too many fingers. Here, I needed to leave an offering of my own blood, mixed with sage ash. I pricked my finger with the bone knife, letting 7 drops fall onto the cave floor. I renew the covenant of my ancestors, I whispered, voice shaking. Blood of my blood maintains the boundary. As I backed out of the cave, I saw them clearly for the first time, 3 tall figures standing among the trees below. Their bodies seemed to shift and flicker, sometimes appearing human, sometimes animal, sometimes something in between. They made no move to approach, but their stillness was somehow more terrifying than any attack. The sun had fully set now. I navigated by flashlight toward the 4th site, an ancient tree stump carved with symbols similar to those in the stone circle. This would be the most dangerous renewal, as it stood at the edge of a clearing exposed to the night sky. As I approached, my flashlight beam caught movement. Dozens of small animals fleeing the area. Rabbits, foxes, even a startled deer burst from the underbrush. They passed me as if I were invisible, driven by terror of something worse than humans. At the stump, I worked quickly, carving fresh symbols with the bone knife, burning sage in the hollow center, reciting prayers that felt increasingly familiar on my tongue. My hands moved with a confidence I didn't consciously possess, as if ancestral memory were guiding me. I was halfway through when I heard it. My name, called in my mother's voice from just behind me. Dakota, stop. You're making a terrible mistake. I didn't turn around. The journal had been clear. Any interruption of the ritual would break the protective circle permanently. Dakota, look at me when I'm talking to you. The voice was perfect, the exact tone of disappointment my mother had used throughout my childhood. But beneath it was something else. Something hungry and ancient. I continued the ritual, hands trembling. Dakota! The voice distorted, deepening into something inhuman. I heard movement behind me, the sound of something large circling just beyond the reach of my light. Multiple somethings. I finished the last symbol, hands slick with sweat. 4 sights renewed. Only the stone circle remained. I turned and ran toward the final location, aware of shapes moving parallel to me through the trees. They no longer bothered concealing themselves. Tall, emaciated figures running on all 4s with impossible speed, sometimes vanishing only to reappear closer. The stone circle waited in the moonless night, my final destination and my only hope of survival. I reached the stone circle with minutes to spare before midnight. The clearing was eerily illuminated by the stars above, unusually bright in the Alaskan sky. My breath came in ragged gasps as I knelt at the circle's edge, hands shaking as I unpacked the final ritual components. They had stopped pursuing me, these skinwalkers. Instead, they formed a loose perimeter around the meadow, 7 or 8 figures of varying heights and shapes, all watching with an intensity I could feel physically. Some appeared almost human, others bent and twisted into impossible forms. All remained just beyond the clearing's edge, as if reluctant to approach the stone circle. Kaya's journal had explained this final ritual in detail. The stone circle was the keystone of the entire boundary. If I could renew it properly, the protection would hold for another generation. If I failed, the boundary would collapse entirely. I placed cedar bundles between each stone. I poured lines of ochre connecting them in patterns shown in the journal. I recited words that felt ancient in my mouth, though I didn't fully understand their meaning. As I worked, I felt a curious sensation, as if hundreds of hands were helping mine, guiding my movements. Generations of ancestors lending their strength. The watching creatures grew restless. They began to call to me, first in familiar voices, my mother, my ex-girlfriend, even Grandma Kaya. Then in voices I didn't recognize but somehow knew I should. When these tactics failed, their calls devolved into inhuman sounds, clicks, growls, and high-pitched keening that made my teeth ache. The final step required me to stand in the center of the circle at exactly midnight and complete the binding prayer. As I moved to the center, the skinwalkers grew frantic. 2 broke from the tree line, racing toward me with impossible speed. I began the prayer, my voice surprisingly steady despite my terror. The first creature reached the edge of the stone circle and recoiled as if struck. The second circled the perimeter, searching for weakness. I stand as guardian of the boundary between worlds, I continued, feeling power building with each word. I renew the covenant made by my ancestors. What walks between cannot pass. What hungers cannot feed. What threatens cannot harm. The air around the circle began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The skinwalkers howled in frustration. One, taller than the rest, with a constantly shifting face, approached the circle's edge and spoke directly to me. "This is temporary, Dakota." Its voice was a grotesque blend of everyone I'd ever loved. "We were here before your kind. We will be here after. The boundary weakens with each generation. Fewer remember, fewer believe. Eventually, no one will come to renew it." I completed the final words of the prayer just as my watch beeped midnight. This land is protected. This boundary holds. Until the stars fall and the mountains crumble, this covenant stands. A pulse of energy expanded from the circle, rippling across the clearing. The skinwalkers retreated, their forms seeming to waver and fade at the boundary of the forest. Their howls diminished into the distance. I remained in the circle until dawn, unwilling to trust my success. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern mountains, I finally allowed myself to believe that I had succeeded, at least for now. The walk back to the cabin was quiet. No eyes watched from the trees. No voices called my name. Birds sang, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. Normal forest sounds that I had never been so grateful to hear. Inside the cabin, I found one final entry in Kaya's journal that I hadn't noticed before. "If you are reading this, Dakota, you have faced them and survived. You have renewed what I could not. The boundary will hold for a time, but remember, they are patient. They will wait and watch and test the edges of our protection. This cabin is your inheritance, but so is this duty. Learn our ways. Strengthen your spirit. The day will come when they test you again." I sit now by the fireplace, writing my own first entry in a new journal. Outside, the forest is alive with spring sounds. For now, the boundary holds. For now, I am safe. But I know they are still out there, beyond the boundary, waiting. And I know that someday, perhaps years from now, The protection will begin to fade. When that day comes, I must be ready. Until then, I will learn the ways of my ancestors. I will strengthen the cabin and myself. I will prepare for the day when the skinwalkers return to test the boundary once more. For this is my inheritance, not just this cabin in the wilderness, but the ancient duty to maintain the boundary between worlds. A duty passed down through generations of my family, now resting on my shoulders. And in the darkest nights, when the wind sounds almost like words and the shadows move in ways shadows shouldn't, I remember Grandma Kaya's final warning. Never forget, Dakota. The boundary goes both ways. Guard not only against what tries to enter our world, but also against the part of yourself that might be drawn to theirs. I never wanted to be a hero. That's the first thing you should understand about me. My Tlingit ancestors called me Kawisdi, which means the one who watches, but most people know me as Coda Rivers, 34 years old and running from a life that had collapsed around me in Seattle. Failed marriage, mounting debt, and a growing emptiness that no amount of city lights could fill. That's how I ended up here, in a remote ranger station in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, Alaska. 8 million acres of wilderness, the largest national park in America. My cabin sits on the edge of the Nebesna district, one of the most isolated corners of an already isolated place. The nearest town is over 60 miles away, and during winter, that might as well be 600. The Park Service was desperate enough to hire me despite my limited experience. Budget cuts had left them short-handed, and few people were willing to endure the isolation. The pay was decent, and more importantly, it came with housing. A one-room cabin with a wood stove, solar panels, and satellite internet that worked when the weather allowed. My debts could wait. Out here, no collection agency could reach me. My first 3 months passed uneventfully. I maintained trails, cataloged wildlife sightings, and occasionally guided the rare visitor who ventured this far into the backcountry. I grew to love the absolute silence that descended at night, broken only by the occasional cry of a wolf or the rustle of wind through spruce trees. Until the night everything changed. It was late September, and winter was approaching fast. I'd spent the day closing up some summer trails and was exhausted. After a simple dinner of canned stew, I settled into my sleeping bag, the wood stove crackling nearby. I woke to scratching. Not the casual scratch of a branch against the roof, but deliberate, persistent scratching at my door. My first thought was bear, though they typically don't scratch. They break things. I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight, calling out in the firm voice they teach you in ranger training. "Hey there, move along now." The scratching stopped. Then came a sound I'll never forget. Something between a whine and a human moan, but wrong. It echoed with an almost musical quality, rising and falling in pitch in a way no animal I knew could produce. I approached the door, shotgun ready. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack. Nothing was there. The motion sensor light illuminated an empty porch, but the snow showed tracks. Not animal prints, not exactly human either. They resembled oversized wolf tracks. But the stride length was impossible, easily 6 feet between prints, and they walked like a human, 2 by 2. I slammed the door shut and spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening. The scratching didn't return, but twice I heard that same mournful sound, distant now, echoing from the forest edge. The next morning I radioed my supervisor, Hank, at the main station. "Probably just a wolverine," he said. "They can make some ungodly sounds. Check your cabin foundation. They like to den underneath structures sometimes." But I knew better. Wolverines don't leave tracks like I'd seen. That afternoon, I hiked to Beaver Lake, about 2 miles from my cabin, to check on some trail cameras. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Twice I spun around, certain I'd catch something following me, but saw nothing. At the lake, I found the first camera torn from its tree, its metal casing crushed as if in a vise. The memory card was missing. The second camera was intact, and I took its card, eager to see what it might have captured. Back at my cabin, I loaded the card onto my laptop. Most footage showed the usual: moose, foxes, a lynx. But the final clip, time-stamped 2:14 a.m. 3 nights ago, showed something that made my blood freeze. A figure crossed the frame at the edge of the camera's infrared range. It moved on two legs but was hunched forward. Its proportions were wrong: arms too long, head too large. When it turned toward the camera, its eyes reflected the infrared like a canine's, but higher off the ground than any wolf. The image was grainy, indistinct, but I couldn't shake the impression that it was wearing something: clothes, or perhaps a uniform not unlike my own ranger jacket. That night I barricaded my door with a chair and kept my shotgun beside me. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that the isolation was getting to me. The native legends my grandfather told me as a child came flooding back. Stories of the Kushtaka, the Tlingit land otter people, who could shift between human and animal form, or the Adlet of Inuit mythology, wolf-like beings who walked as men. Just stories, I told myself. Just stories to explain the unexplainable in this vast, uncaring wilderness. But as I drifted to sleep, I heard it again, that terrible whining howl, closer now. And underlying it, almost too faint to detect, what sounded like words: "Coda, help me." The morning brought 6 inches of fresh snow and an uneasy silence. After a restless night punctuated by distant howls, I needed answers. I packed my day pack with essentials: GPS, first aid kit, flare gun, hunting knife, bear spray, and my personal sidearm, a Glock 20 loaded with 10mm rounds, powerful enough to stop a charging bear. Regulations frowned on rangers carrying personal firearms, but out here, rules bent to survival. I followed the strange tracks from my porch. In daylight, they seemed even more unsettling, canine in shape, but with 5 distinct toe impressions rather than 4. The stride length remained unnaturally long, and occasionally the pattern shifted as if the creature had momentarily dropped to all fours before resuming its bipedal gait. The tracks led northeast toward Ptarmigan Creek, an area known for its abandoned mining cabins from the Copper Rush era. As I hiked, I noted other oddities: sections of bark stripped from trees at a height of 7 feet, too high for a bear standing on hind legs; strange markings carved into several trunks, not the random scratches of wildlife, but deliberate patterns of parallel lines. 3 miles in, I found the first signs of violence. A moose carcass, fresh enough that scavengers hadn't yet discovered it, lay partially concealed in a thicket. The killing method made no sense. No signs of wolf-pack tactics, no bear's crushing bite to the spine. Instead, the animal's throat had been torn out with surgical precision, and long, deep gashes ran down its flanks, claw marks spaced like fingers. Most disturbing was what appeared to be deliberately arranged stones around the carcass, forming a rough circle. I'd seen enough. This wasn't animal behavior. I took photos, marked the GPS coordinates, and continued following the tracks with growing apprehension. By early afternoon, I reached Ptarmigan Creek and the first of the abandoned cabins. The tracks led directly to the doorway of the largest structure, an old foreman's quarters. The door hung partially open, swinging gently in the breeze. "Hello?" I called, gripping my Glock. "Park Service. Anyone here?" No response, but something caught my eye. A flash of bright orange fabric inside. Standard issue Park Service cold weather gear. I approached cautiously, pushing the door fully open with my boot. The cabin's interior was dim, the windows boarded except for one small pane that admitted a shaft of gray light. In that beam, I saw a Park Service backpack, torn open, its contents scattered. A handheld radio lay nearby, its plastic casing cracked. My throat tightened as I recognized the gear. It belonged to Marcus Yazzie, a Navajo ranger assigned to the Eastern District. We'd met during training, though we rarely crossed paths in the field. What was he doing this far from his patrol area? I keyed my own radio. "Dispatch, this is Rivers at Ptarmigan Creek Old Mining Site. I've found Ranger Yazzie's equipment, but no sign of him. Over." Static, then a broken response. "Copy. Yazzie should be Eastern Sector. Report." The transmission died. I tried again with no success. As I examined the cabin, the hairs on my neck rose. The walls were covered with what appeared to be charcoal drawings, crude but recognizable depictions of a bipedal creature with a canine head. Some showed it hunting. Others depicted it standing among human figures. The drawings seemed fresh, the charcoal still smudging under my fingertips. In the corner, partially hidden under a fallen roof beam, I found Marcus's journal. The last entry, dated just 3 days ago, read, "Day 14 of tracking what locals call the Watcher. Spotted it clearly yesterday at dusk. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a man. I know how this sounds, but it walked on 2 legs and stood at least 7 feet tall. Its proportions were wrong, almost like a human body with a wolf's head and limbs. It watched me for nearly 10 minutes before disappearing into the trees. The Nabesna locals won't talk about it directly, but an elder mentioned something called Tata Klea from Atna legends, the man who became wolf. Said they've been seen more frequently since they started the new mining surveys up north. Tomorrow I'll try to make contact. It seems intelligent. Not an animal, not fully. God help me, I think it's been trying to communicate." The journal ended there. I pocketed it, my mouth dry with fear. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. Marcus's heavy winter parka hanging from a nail on the wall. No ranger would voluntarily leave that behind in these temperatures. Beside it, scratched into the wall with what appeared to be claw marks, was a crude map showing the nearby mountains, a circle marking a location about 5 miles north. The sun was already low in the sky. I had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left, not enough to reach the marked location and return safely. Logic dictated I return to my cabin and radio for a search party. But then I heard it, that same whining howl from outside, followed by words that froze my blood. "Help! Me! Rivers! My name!" It knew my name. I raised my weapon and moved to the doorway. Outside, at the forest's edge, about 100 yards away, stood a figure. Even at this distance, I could see it wasn't human. Its proportions were wrong, its stance unnatural. When it saw me watching, it raised an arm in a disturbingly human gesture of beckoning. Then it turned and loped into the trees. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I followed. Night falls quickly in the Alaskan wilderness, especially in autumn. By the time I'd followed the creature a mile into the forest, darkness had descended completely. My headlamp carved a pitiful cone of light through the gloom, snow swirling in its beam. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and my breath crystallized before my face. The tracks remained clear, those same impossible prints punched deep into the fresh snow. They led steadily northward, toward the area marked on the crude map I'd found. According to my GPS, we were approaching the Rambler Mine, an abandoned copper operation that had closed in the 1950s after a catastrophic cave-in killed 23 miners. The incident was notorious in ranger lore, not just for the deaths, but for the stories that emerged afterward. Survivors spoke of something they'd uncovered in the deepest shaft, something that had been sealed away in the copper vein. Most historians attributed these tales to carbon monoxide poisoning or trauma, but the stories persisted for decades. I kept my sidearm drawn, though my fingers were growing numb despite my gloves. The cold wasn't the only reason for my trembling. Twice more, I'd caught glimpses of the figure, once crouched atop a ridge, silhouetted against the night sky, and again moving parallel to my path about 50 yards to my right, partially visible through the trees. "Marcus," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. "Marcus Yazzie, if you can hear me, respond." Only the wind answered, moaning through the spruce boughs. But then, a sound ahead. A rhythmic tapping, metallic and deliberate. Morse code? I strained to decipher it, but couldn't make out a pattern. The trees thinned, and I found myself at the edge of a clearing dominated by the decaying infrastructure of the Rambler mine. Collapsed outbuildings, rusted equipment, and the dark maw of the main shaft entrance, its timber supports rotting but still standing. The tapping emanated from within. Park Service protocol was clear. Abandoned mines were strictly off-limits without proper equipment and backup. The dangers were numerous: cave-ins, toxic gas pockets, flooded chambers. But the thought of Marcus potentially injured inside overrode my training. I approached the entrance, sweeping my light across the weathered warning sign. Danger, unstable ground, no entry. Below it, someone had recently carved those same parallel lines I'd seen on the trees. 5 vertical marks crossed by a diagonal. The tapping stopped as I reached the entrance. I switched my headlamp to its brightest setting and peered inside. The main tunnel extended about 30 feet before branching in 3 directions. Mining equipment littered the floor: pickaxes, shovels, a rusted ore cart on partially collapsed tracks. "Marcus," I called again. My voice echoed down the tunnels, returning distorted and hollow. A scraping sound came from the leftmost tunnel, like claws on stone. Then a voice, barely recognizable as human. "Coda, here!" It wasn't Marcus's voice. I'd only met him briefly, but I knew that much. Yet it called me by my first name, not Rivers or Ranger as any colleague would. Every instinct screamed for retreat. But I thought of the journal entry. It seems intelligent. And the map deliberately left for me to find. Whatever this thing was, it wanted me here specifically. I advanced into the mine, the beam of my headlamp bouncing off glistening walls. The air grew noticeably warmer as I moved deeper, which made no sense given the outside temperature. The left tunnel sloped gently downward, the old support timbers groaning ominously. Water dripped somewhere ahead, a steady metronomic patter. 20 yards in, I found the first body. It lay crumpled against the wall, the remains of a man in hunting gear, months old judging by the decomposition. No obvious cause of death was visible, but the posture suggested he'd been fleeing deeper into the mine, not toward the exit. I should have turned back then, called in a full emergency response team. But something compelled me forward. Morbid curiosity, or perhaps some ancestral instinct responding to the ancient symbols I'd seen. The tunnel widened into a chamber, where the miners had followed a particularly rich vein. My light revealed more recent disturbances: fresh boot prints in the dust and what appeared to be a campsite. A sleeping bag, backpack, and portable stove lay arranged near the chamber's center. Beside them, a Park Service field notebook lay open. I approached cautiously, sweeping my light and weapon across the shadowed corners of the chamber. The notebook contained Marcus's handwriting, increasingly erratic in later entries. Day 15, it led me here. There are others. They're changing. The copper in the walls blocks radio signals. The symbols mean doorway in the old language. Day 16, they were miners, trapped. Found something older, merged with it to survive. Can't look directly at the original one. Too painful to comprehend. Day 17, the transformation has begun. My hands first, then voice. They need new blood, fresh DNA. The copper preserves but changes. Ancient defense mechanism, I understand now. The final entry was barely legible. The letters malformed as if written by a hand no longer fully human. Rivers will understand. Tlingit blood, compatible, needs to see. A low growl emanated from a tunnel at the chamber's far side. A passage I hadn't noticed before, its entrance oddly angular, the stone around it carved with those same 5-line symbols. My light caught movement within. A figure emerged, hunched to fit through the opening. It straightened to its full height, easily 7 feet tall. Its body resembled a man's, though the proportions were wrong, arms too long, torso too narrow. But its head, the head was unmistakably canine. a wolf's skull structure, but with human eyes peering from beneath a heavy brow ridge. Where skin should have been was a patchwork of fur and what appeared to be ranger uniform fabric, fused in a grotesque melding of man and beast. Around its neck hung a Park Service badge. "Marcus," I whispered, bile rising in my throat. The creature cocked its head, a disturbingly human gesture. When it spoke, the sound emerged from a throat not designed for human speech. Not just "Marcus" anymore. It took a step toward me, clawed hands extended. "We need you, Coda." I raised my weapon, backing toward the exit. "Stay back." The creature stopped, tilting its head the other way. Behind it, more shapes moved in the darkness of the angular tunnel. Some quadrupedal, others bipedal, all wrong. "You don't understand," the Marcus thing said. "Not danger, salvation." It gestured toward the passage behind it. "Come, see what we found." I kept my Glock trained on the creature as I edged sideways, trying to maintain distance while working my way toward the exit tunnel. My headlamp beam caught the reflective eyes of more shapes moving in the darkness behind Marcus, or what had once been Marcus. "What happened to you?" I asked, desperate to buy time. The thing that had been Marcus Yazzie dropped to all fours, then rose again in a fluid motion that no human spine could achieve. Its jaw extended, revealing teeth too numerous and sharp for either man or wolf. "Evolution," it rasped, the word barely recognizable. "Adaptation, the copper in the walls, catalyst." Behind me, a growl. I spun to find my retreat blocked by another creature, smaller, moving on four legs, but with hands where front paws should be. Its face was a grotesque hybrid, one side recognizably human, the other lupine. The Park Service insignia was still visible on the shredded uniform clinging to its misshapen body. I was trapped. "Come, see," Marcus Thing insisted, gesturing again toward the angular passage. "Understanding requires witnessing." What choice did I have? With creatures blocking both directions, I moved cautiously toward the passage, keeping my weapon ready. The tunnel beyond was unlike the rest of the mine, not rough-hewn by human tools, but eerily precise, its walls smooth and lined with a greenish copper patina. The air grew warmer, humid, carrying an organic smell like wet fur mixed with something metallic. The passage descended at a steep angle, forcing me to brace against the walls. My light revealed strange petroglyphs carved into the copper-infused stone, humanoid figures transforming into wolf-like beings, arranged in circular patterns around a central shape that hurt my eyes to look at directly. After what seemed like hundreds of feet of descent, the passage opened into a vast chamber that couldn't possibly have been created by the mining operation. My headlamp couldn't penetrate its full expanse, but what I could see defied explanation. The chamber was roughly circular, its ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls glowed with veins of copper that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. In the center stood what I first took to be a stalagmite, a column of stone rising from the floor. But as my light played across it, I realized the truth. It wasn't stone. It was a pile of bodies, or rather, parts of bodies in various stages of transformation. Human limbs fused with canine features, torsos splitting open to reveal new anatomies emerging from within. At the pile's base lay recent additions. I recognized the clothing of hikers reported missing last summer. I stumbled backward, raising my weapon, but the Marcus Thing placed a clawed hand on my arm with surprising gentleness. "Not death," it said. "Chrysalis." The central mass pulsed, and I heard a collective moan from the creatures gathering around the chamber's perimeter. Dozens of them in various stages of transformation, some nearly human, others barely recognizable as once having been human at all. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice echoing across the chamber. Another creature approached, this one more articulate, its transformation apparently more advanced, yet somehow more harmonious. When it spoke, the voice was almost musical, with harmonics impossible for a human throat. "We were the first miners," it said. 1938. "We broke into this chamber and found what waited below. It had been here since before humans walked upright, trapped in copper that inhibited its ability to transform humans directly. But proximity was enough. It changed us slowly." I stared at the speaker, trying to process what I was hearing. "That's impossible. That was over 80 years ago." "Time works differently for us now," it replied. "The original miners realized they couldn't leave. They were changing. So they staged the cave-in of 1951, sealed themselves in to protect the outside world. But they never died." "And now?" I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. "New mining surveys have fractured our containment. We can emerge again. Some have already scattered into the wilderness, but we need compatibles. Those with genetic markers that allow full integration rather than partial transformation." It gestured toward some of the more grotesque hybrids lurking in the shadows, beings caught between states, their forms unstable and clearly suffering. "Your friend Marcus was compatible," it continued, "and he recognized something in you. Tlingit blood carries ancient markers. Your people encountered something similar centuries ago. The legends of skinwalkers, of human-animal hybrids, they're based in biological fact." My mind raced through my grandfather's stories, beings that shifted between human and animal form. I'd always assumed they were metaphors, ways to explain the dual nature of humanity. What if they were warnings? The Marcus thing stepped closer. "Join us," it rasped. "Perfect. The transformation. Help us adapt, survive." "And if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer. The collective growl from the gathered creatures told me everything. They would not let me leave with knowledge of their existence. My options were transformation or death. I raised my weapon again, but a sudden movement from above caught my attention. Something was descending from the darkness of the ceiling. Something massive. As it entered the glow of the bioluminescent copper, I finally saw what had been transforming these people. The original, the source. My mind couldn't properly process its form. A mass of shifting anatomies, both canine and human features emerging and receding in a constant flow, centered around a core that seemed to bend light around it. It had no fixed shape, yet contained recognizable elements of every creature it had absorbed and transformed. As it touched the floor of the chamber, every hybrid being prostrated itself. The Marcus thing dropped to all fours, its back arching unnaturally. "The first one," it whispered. "Come to welcome you." The monstrosity extended what might have been a limb toward me. Where it touched the stone floor, the rock itself began to transform, becoming something organic and pulsing. In that moment, I made my choice. I fired, not at the creature, but at the copper-veined ceiling above it. My 10 rounds sparked against the metal, and a piece of the ceiling collapsed, crushing one of the hybrid creatures. The others howled in rage. I turned and ran, firing behind me without aiming. The narrow passage worked to my advantage. The creatures could only come at me one or two at a time. I emptied my magazine into the pursuing shapes, then fled upward through the tunnel, my lungs burning. Behind me, an otherworldly screech echoed through the passage. The source, calling its children to hunt. The chase had begun. I burst from the mine entrance into the shocking cold of the Alaskan night, gasping for breath. The temperature difference hit me like a physical blow after the unnatural warmth of the chamber below. Stars glittered overhead in a moonless sky, offering minimal light to navigate by. No time to catch my breath. Howls echoed from the mine behind me. Not wolf howls, but something that mimicked them through vocal cords caught between human and canine. I reloaded my Glock with numb fingers, fumbling a magazine from my pocket. My headlamp revealed my own tracks leading back toward Ptarmigan Creek, offering an easy trail for the creatures to follow. I needed another option. The old mining complex spread out before me, collapsed outbuildings, rusted equipment, and a decrepit water tower listing dangerously to one side. The first of the dogmen emerged from the mine entrance, a smaller one moving on all fours with unnatural speed. I fired twice, catching it in mid-leap. It crashed to the ground with a too-human cry of pain, but immediately began to rise again, its wound visibly closing as I watched. Conventional weapons wouldn't stop them permanently. I needed another strategy. I sprinted toward the processing building, a two-story structure of corrugated metal with broken windows and a partially collapsed roof. Inside, ancient machinery loomed in the darkness, ore crushers, sorting tables, and a massive boiler that once powered the operation. The air reeked of rust and old chemicals. More howls outside. They were surrounding the building. I had minutes at most. My training kicked in. Threat assessment, resource inventory, survival priorities. I quickly took stock of my resources. My sidearm with 2 remaining magazines, a hunting knife, bear spray, a flare gun with 3 flares, my radio, useless this far from any receiver, my GPS, and a lighter. The building offered potential weapons as well. Old tools lay scattered about. Pickaxes, sledgehammers, pry bars. More importantly, barrels of chemicals lined one wall, unmarked, but likely mining solvents. Next to them stood canisters of what appeared to be kerosene for the lamps. A desperate plan formed in my mind. I grabbed a metal container of kerosene and began splashing it around the building's perimeter, focusing on the entrances. With my knife, I punctured several of the chemical barrels, creating pools of noxious liquid that spread across the floor. The fumes made my eyes water and my throat burn. Outside, shapes darted between structures, some bipedal, others quadrupedal, but all moving with a fluid grace that melded the strengths of both forms. I caught glimpses of reflective eyes watching from the darkness, more appearing every minute. The Marcus thing's voice called out, still recognizable despite its transformation. Coda, no. Escape. Accept. Gift. I positioned myself on the second floor, which offered a partial view of the surroundings through broken windows and holes in the walls. Below, I heard the first of them enter the building, claws clicking on concrete. The creature that had once been Marcus Yazzie stood in the doorway, more wolf than human now, but still wearing tatters of his ranger uniform. Behind him, at least a dozen more shapes gathered, with others visible in the distance emerging from the mine entrance. Last chance, it growled. Resistance brings pain. I've seen what you offer, I shouted back. I choose humanity. It snarled and launched itself forward with impossible speed, leaping halfway up the stairs toward my position. Behind it, more creatures poured into the building. I raised my flare gun and fired, not at the creatures, but at the pool of chemicals and kerosene I'd created. The flare struck and ignited with a whoosh that became a roar as flames raced along my prepared trails of accelerant. Fire erupted throughout the first floor. The creatures howled in pain and confusion as flames engulfed them. The Marcus thing leapt back, its fur singed, rage contorting its canine features into something even more monstrous. I hadn't expected the chemical fire to spread so quickly. Within seconds, the entire first floor was an inferno, with flames climbing the walls toward my position. The ancient timbers, dry from decades of abandonment, caught instantly. Through the flames, I saw the creatures retreating, their healing abilities apparently no match for fire. But I'd trapped myself as well. Smoke billowed up the staircase, choking me and stinging my eyes. The heat became unbearable. With no choice left, I moved to a window on the building's north side, the only direction not yet fully engulfed. Looking down, I saw a snowdrift that had accumulated against the wall. Perhaps 10 feet below, not a safe drop, but my only option. As the floor beneath me began to crack and groan, I launched myself through the window. The landing was harder than I'd anticipated, a jarring impact that drove the air from my lungs and sent a spike of pain through my left ankle. Sprained or broken, I couldn't tell through the adrenaline. I struggled to my feet, coughing from the smoke that now poured from every opening in the building. The fire had spread to adjacent structures, creating a wall of flame between me and the mine entrance. Good, it might buy me time, but my relief was short-lived. A movement to my right, a massive shape emerging from the shadows beyond the fire's light. The original. It had found another way out of the mine. Its form seemed even more fluid in the open air, constantly shifting between anatomies, as if unable to decide on a final shape. Where it touched the snow, the ground steamed and transformed, becoming something organic and pulsing. I limped backward, raising my Glock with trembling hands. The creature paused, regarding me with what seemed like curiosity. Then it spoke, not in words, but directly into my mind. "You cannot escape evolution, child of the first people. Your ancestors knew us. They carried our seeds in their blood. You are already changing." To my horror, I realized the burning sensation in my hands wasn't just from the cold. Fine dark hairs were sprouting across my knuckles, and my fingernails had elongated slightly, curving into points. The transformation had already begun. The creature extended a limb, or perhaps it was a tendril of its essence, toward me. Accept the gift. Become. I raised my weapon and emptied the magazine into the shifting mass of the original. The bullets seemed to pass through it without effect, disappearing into its undulating form. Behind me lay the dark forest and a desperate chance at escape. Behind the creature lay the burning buildings and the mine, and perhaps answers about how to stop the transformation now beginning in my own body. I made my choice and charged directly at the original, dodging its reaching tendrils. Pain lanced through my changing limbs as I sprinted past the creature, toward the inferno I had created. If I couldn't escape the transformation, I would find its source and destroy it. The heat hit me like a physical wall as I circled the burning processing plant. Flames had engulfed most of the mining complex, but the main shaft entrance remained accessible, its timber supports blackened, but still standing. The fire would eventually reach it too, potentially collapsing the entire underground network. My body was changing more rapidly now. Pain radiated from my joints as bones began to shift beneath my skin. My vision had altered, sharper at night, with colors fading to be replaced by acute awareness of movement and depth. I could smell the original pursuing me, an indescribable scent of ancient copper and organic decay. I had minutes at most before the transformation progressed beyond my ability to control my actions. Already animal instincts were surfacing in my mind. Urges to hunt, to run on all fours, to join the pack howling in the distance. I forced myself to focus on my plan. If copper was the catalyst, as the creatures had claimed, perhaps it was also their vulnerability. The miners had contained the original by sealing it in a copper-rich environment for decades. Its emergence coincided with new mining activity disturbing that containment. The answer lay below, in the chamber where it all began. I staggered into the mine entrance, my misshapen hands clutching my last flare gun cartridge and the GPS unit. Behind me, the original's presence pressed against my consciousness like a physical weight. Futile. You cannot undo what has begun. Watch me, I growled, my voice already rougher, deeper. I navigated the main tunnel from memory, the changes in my vision allowing me to see in the near-total darkness. The left passage loomed ahead, the way to the ancient chamber. I could feel the pull of the source growing stronger as I approached, calling to the new DNA now rewriting my own. The passage seemed different now, wider, the strange angular architecture more pronounced. The copper veins in the walls pulsed with increased bioluminescence, responding to the original's proximity behind me. I stumbled down the steep decline, my transforming body actually better adapted to the awkward angle. My boots no longer fit properly as my feet elongated, and I kicked them off, continuing barefoot with increasingly claw-like toes gripping the stone. The vast chamber opened before me, now fully illuminated by the glowing copper veins. The pile of transforming bodies at its center pulsed with renewed energy, as if aware of the original's imminent return and my potential addition to the mass. I checked my GPS unit. No signal, as expected this deep underground. But it showed what I needed, the stored map with elevation data. The chamber sat directly beneath the western slope of Porphyry Mountain. Above it, according to geological surveys loaded in my unit, lay one of the largest unexploited copper deposits in the region. The answer crystallized in my pain-addled mind. Copper contained them, but pure copper, concentrated and electrified, might destroy them. Lightning strikes to copper created energy that could theoretically— I had no time to work out the details. The original was descending into the chamber, its presence overwhelming my thoughts with alien imperatives. My transformation accelerated, fur spreading across my arms, my jaw extending painfully. With the last of my human consciousness, I climbed the central pile of bodies, ignoring their moans and movements. At its peak, I raised my GPS unit to the chamber's ceiling, confirming my position directly beneath the copper deposit. I loaded my final flare, aimed upward, and fired. The flare streaked toward the ceiling, illuminating the vast dome above in harsh red light. It struck a cluster of copper veins and exploded in a shower of sparks, not enough to damage the thick stone, but enough to mark my target. Taking my hunting knife, now awkward in my half-transformed hand, I began digging into the pile beneath me. The bodies shifted and moaned, but none had enough individual consciousness left to resist. Beneath their mass, I found what I'd suspected: mining explosives, left behind when the original miners sealed themselves away. Decades old, but dynamite remained stable in the cool, dry conditions of a mine. 6 weathered sticks bound together, with a deteriorated but potentially functional blasting cap. The original had nearly reached the chamber floor, its vast, shifting form blocking the passage behind it. Hybrid creatures were emerging from side tunnels, drawn by their master's presence. "You cannot destroy what has existed since before your kind walked upright," it projected into my mind. "We have survived extinction events. We have waited in Earth's depths for millennia." My voice, barely human now, rasped out, "Then wait a little longer." I struck my emergency lighter. The flame caught the ancient fuse, which sputtered, then glowed steady. 30 seconds, perhaps less. The original surged forward, sensing my intent. Its form expanded, reaching tendrils toward me to stop what I'd set in motion. Around me, the hybrid creatures howled in alarm. I locked eyes with the creature that had once been Marcus Yazzie, seeing a flicker of human understanding in its transformed face. "Run!" I managed to growl. Then I leapt from the central pile, dynamite clutched to my chest, and charged directly at the original. Its mass enveloped me, a sensation like being plunged into freezing liquid that burned simultaneously. I pushed deeper, fighting through its substance, aiming for what seemed like a denser core. The fuse burned down. The explosion was both more and less than I expected. No dramatic fireball, but a concussive force that rippled through the original's form and into the chamber ceiling above. Stone cracked, copper veins shattered, and the ceiling began to collapse. What happened next exists in my memory as fragmented images, the original's silent scream reverberating through my mind. Massive chunks of copper-laden stone falling into the chamber, a peculiar electrical discharge as the copper deposit above connected with the veins in the chamber. Blue-green lightning arcing through the collapsing space. The hybrid creatures fleeing in panic, some burning with an eerie blue flame where the energy discharge touched them. The original's form disintegrating where the pure copper embedded itself, its essence seemingly absorbed and neutralized by the metal, and darkness. Complete darkness as the mine collapsed around me. I should have died. Perhaps in a way, I did. 3 days later, I clawed my way out of the rubble on the western slope of Porphyry Mountain, where the collapse had opened a fissure to the surface. My body was changed. Not fully transformed, but not fully human either. The copper had arrested the process midway, leaving me caught between states. I made my way back to my cabin through the wilderness, moving sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, avoiding human contact. My mind remained my own, though new instincts and perceptions now lived alongside my human consciousness. The official report listed Ranger Coda Rivers as missing, presumed dead in a mining site collapse that was attributed to unexpected geological instability. Similarly, Ranger Marcus Yazzie was declared lost in the line of duty. A memorial service was held for both of us at Park Service headquarters the following month. I watched from the forest's edge, already learning to hide my changed form from human eyes. Most of the hybrid creatures died in the collapse, but I know some escaped into the vastness of Wrangell St. Elias. Sometimes on clear nights when the moon is full, I hear their distant howls. Fewer each year, their transformations unstable without the original to guide them. As for the source itself, I believe it is truly gone, its essence neutralized by direct contact with the copper that once contained it. The mine site has been permanently sealed by the Park Service, though they don't know the real reason why they feel such urgency to keep people away. I remain in the wilderness, a watcher on the boundary between worlds. My Tlingit name, Kawiste, the one who watches, has taken on new meaning. I patrol the borders of the park, ensuring no hikers stray too close to remaining hybrid territories, guiding lost travelers back to safety without revealing myself. And I search for others like me, caught between transformations, neither fully human nor fully other. We are few, but we exist, guardians of a secret truth about what lies beneath the wilderness. If you find yourself lost in the remote reaches of Wrangell St. Elias and feel eyes watching from the forest edge, do not be afraid. It may be me, ensuring you find your way safely home. But if you hear a whining howl that sounds almost like human words calling your name, run. Run, and don't look back. Not everything that walks these woods remembers being human. I relocated to the small coastal town of Havermill in northern Maine for a research position at the Marine Biology Institute. Despite arriving in early November, I was eager to explore the natural surroundings, particularly Mistwood Sanctuary, a protected forest area that bordered the eastern edge of town. I had heard colleagues mention the scenic hiking paths that wound through the old-growth forest, and with limited social connections in my new home, outdoor exploration seemed like a productive way to spend my weekend. The weather forecast predicted clear skies with moderate temperatures, unusual for that time of year in Maine. I prepared appropriately, packing a small backpack with water, trail mix, a compass, and my phone. The entrance to Mistwood was a mere 10-minute walk from my rented cottage. The forest welcomed me with a crisp, earthy scent and the gentle rustling of leaves. Though most had fallen, patches of dark evergreens provided color against the backdrop of bare deciduous trees. The trail was well marked with blue blazes on trees at regular intervals, and I walked at a comfortable pace, taking occasional photographs of interesting fungi and plant formations. After approximately 45 minutes of hiking, I noticed a thin layer of mist beginning to gather between the trees. This wasn't entirely unexpected near the coast, but something about its movement caught my attention. Rather than drifting with the gentle breeze, it seemed to swirl in contained patterns, almost purposefully. I dismissed this observation as a trick of light and continued walking. The forest had become remarkably quiet. The earlier sounds of birds and small animals had ceased, leaving only the sound of my boots on the leaf-covered path. I checked my watch, just past noon. I had plenty of daylight remaining and decided to continue for another hour before turning back. That's when I first heard it, a faint melodic humming coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, off the established trail. The sound was barely perceptible, yet distinctly human, or at least it resembled human vocalization. Male or female, I couldn't determine. It existed at the edge of audibility, haunting and somehow melancholic. I paused, straining to identify the direction. The mist had thickened significantly in the past 10 minutes, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards. The humming seemed to come from my left, away from the trail. Common sense dictated staying on the marked path, but curiosity, that most dangerous of human traits, urged me forward. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The humming ceased immediately. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing beyond the occasional drop of moisture from the trees. After nearly a minute of silence, I convinced myself I had imagined it, and resumed walking along the trail. 3 steps later, the humming resumed, closer this time and to my right. I turned sharply, scanning the misty forest. Through the vapor, approximately 30 yards away, I detected movement. A figure, indistinct in the haze, appeared to be standing motionless between 2 ancient oak trees. "Excuse me," I called again. "Are you all right?" The figure made no response, but seemed to drift slightly backward, deeper into the mist. I hesitated, torn between concern for a potentially lost hiker and my own safety. Eventually, I stepped off the trail, moving cautiously toward where I had seen the figure. As I approached, I discerned more details. It appeared to be a person of indeterminate gender, dressed in what looked like flowing gray garments that blended with the surrounding mist. Most notable was that the figure seemed partially transparent. I could faintly see the outline of trees behind it. Logic suggested this must be an optical illusion created by the unusual mist patterns, yet my instincts screamed otherwise. I stopped advancing, suddenly aware of the profound silence surrounding me. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind in the branches. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The figure turned, or seemed to turn, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been a face. It was difficult to process what I saw, features that appeared fluid, constantly shifting and reforming, with only the suggestion of eyes. Dark hollows where mist swirled more densely. Then it was moving away from me, its form becoming more indistinct with each yard of distance. Against my better judgment, I followed. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Unusual atmospheric conditions, fatigue, perhaps even mild hypoxia from the altitude. Yet I pursued this apparition deeper into the forest, leaving the trail far behind. Time became difficult to track. The mist thickened until visibility reduced to mere feet in any direction. My phone's GPS showed no signal, and the compass, spinning erratically, suggested some form of magnetic anomaly in the area. The humming continued intermittently, always just ahead, drawing me forward. I'm uncertain how long I wandered. The consistent gray light filtering through the mist made it impossible to judge the sun's position. Eventually, I stopped, finally acknowledging that I was hopelessly lost. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the mist now carried a bitter chill that penetrated my jacket. I attempted to retrace my steps, but found no recognizable landmarks. Each direction appeared identical, gray trees emerging from and disappearing into swirling vapor. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 4:38 p.m. Daylight would last only another hour at most. I needed to establish some direction, find the trail again, or at minimum locate a suitable place to wait until morning. That's when I noticed the silence had changed. The utter absence of sound had been replaced by something more unsettling, a soft susurration, like countless whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. It seemed to emanate from the mist itself, surrounding me completely. I forced myself to remain calm, to think logically. I pulled out my compass again, finding it still useless. I would have to rely on natural navigation methods, moss growth, tree branching patterns, but in the dim light and thick mist, these were difficult to discern. The whispering intensified, and with growing horror, I realized I could almost understand fragments of words. Not in English, not in any language I recognized, yet somehow conveying meaning, invitation, hunger, loneliness. The mist began to change. What had been formless vapor now appeared to coalesce into numerous, vaguely humanoid shapes, surrounding me in a loose circle. None were as distinct as the figure I had initially followed, but all possessed those same disturbing characteristics, shifting features and dark swirling voids where eyes should be. I retreated until my back pressed against a large tree trunk. The figures drew closer, the whispering growing more urgent. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, hoping light might disperse whatever atmospheric phenomenon was causing these hallucinations. The beam cut through the mist, temporarily creating a tunnel of visibility. The figures seemed to recoil, their forms becoming less distinct. Taking advantage of their retreat, I pushed forward in the direction the light pointed, moving as quickly as I dared through the treacherous terrain. The whispering followed, sometimes fading, sometimes intensifying, but never completely disappearing. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of the figures reforming at the edge of my light's reach. Twice, I nearly lost my footing on slippery, moss-covered stones, and once I stumbled into a shallow depression filled with icy water that soaked through my hiking boots. The temperature continued to drop. My extremities grew numb, and my breath formed thick clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The phone's battery indicator warned of imminent shutdown, perhaps 15 minutes of light remaining at most. That's when I noticed something ahead, a different quality of darkness. Not the gray opacity of mist, but the solid blackness of a substantial object. Moving cautiously forward, I discovered a stone structure, partially collapsed but still offering shelter. It appeared to be the remnants of an old boundary wall, or perhaps a small outbuilding. With no better options, I clambered over the fallen stones to reach the relatively protected interior space. The walls blocked some of the mist, creating a small pocket of improved visibility. I directed my failing flashlight around the enclosure, finding it empty save for years of accumulated leaf litter and a few small animal bones. I wedged myself into a corner where two walls met, providing maximum protection from the elements and a defensive position against whatever might approach. My phone battery failed moments later, plunging me into near-total darkness. The whispering crescendoed immediately, as if the mist figures had been waiting for this moment. Through gaps in the stonework, I could see the vapor thickening, forming more substantial apparitions. The temperature plummeted further. My breath now emerged in painful gasps of frigid air. One figure, more defined than the others, pushed through a large opening in the wall. It resembled the entity I had first followed, but appeared more substantial now. As it approached, I could see that what I had mistaken for gray clothing was actually its form. Mist condensed to the consistency of thin fabric, constantly shifting and reforming. Where a face should have been, the mist swirled more densely, occasionally forming the suggestion of human features before dissolving again. Only the eyes remained constant, not eyes in the conventional sense, but rather absences, voids in the mist that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The whispering focused, becoming a single voice, still incomprehensible, yet conveying emotions rather than words, loneliness, hunger, and something that felt disturbingly like joy. The figure extended what might have been an arm reaching toward me. The temperature around me dropped so severely that the moisture in the air began crystallizing, forming delicate patterns of frost on the stones beside me. My lungs burned with each inhalation of the supernaturally cold air. I pressed further into my corner, searching frantically for anything that might serve as a weapon or deterrent. My hand closed around a broken piece of stone, jagged and heavy. In desperation, I hurled it directly at the approaching figure. The stone passed through the misty form without resistance, clattering against the wall beyond. The entity paused momentarily, the swirling patterns of its composition disturbed, then continued its advance. Its arm-like extension was inches from my face when I noticed something. The small digital watch on my wrist, with its modest backlight, seemed to cause distortion in the entity's form wherever the light touched it. The mist being withdrew slightly, the whispering taking on a quality I could only interpret as discomfort. Light. They retreated from my flashlight earlier. With numbed fingers, I fumbled with the watch, managing to activate its alarm function. The small screen glowed brighter and the entity withdrew further, its form becoming less substantial. I held the watch out like a talisman, waving it toward the mist figures that had gathered at the opening in the wall. They maintained their distance, their whispering now carrying tones of frustration and anger. The standoff continued for what felt like hours. I remained huddled in my corner, watch extended, fighting against exhaustion and the dangerous drowsiness induced by the cold. The mist beings hovered at the edge of the watch's feeble light, occasionally testing its boundaries but retreating when the illumination touched them. At some point during this vigil, I must have lost consciousness despite my determination to remain awake. When awareness returned, pale natural light was filtering through the mist. The stone enclosure was empty of anything but ordinary morning fog, and the temperature, while cold, had returned to seasonal norms. I stood on unsteady legs, muscles protesting after hours of immobility in the cold. Outside the stone structure, the forest appeared entirely normal, no sign of the unnatural mist or its inhabitants. In the distance, perhaps a quarter-mile away, I could see a flash of blue, a trail marker. The hike back to town was uneventful. I reached the main trail within 30 minutes and followed it directly to the forest entrance. Upon returning to my cottage, I discovered my ordeal had lasted nearly 20 hours. I had entered Mistwood shortly after 10 a.m. the previous day and emerged just after 6 a.m. I reported nothing to local authorities. What could I say that wouldn't sound like the product of hypothermia-induced hallucination? Instead, I conducted research at the town's small historical society, discovering references to mist walkers in local folklore dating back to early colonial times. The accounts described travelers lost in the forest who encountered beings of fog and vapor that whispered in unknown tongues. Those who survived reported the entities seemed to feed on warmth and vitality. Most telling was a journal entry from 1887, written by a local physician. It appears these manifestations retreat from artificial light, particularly that produced by flame. The more intense the illumination, the more complete their dissolution. I hypothesize that the concentrated energy disrupts whatever electromagnetic anomaly permits their existence. I left Havermill 2 weeks later, citing family emergency to terminate my contract at the Institute. Before departing, I posted warning signs at the Mistwood Trail entrance, cautioning hikers about sudden fog conditions and recommending they carry multiple light sources. The town council removed them within days, concerned about tourism impact. 3 hikers have disappeared in Mistwood since my departure. Searches found no trace, and officials blame treacherous terrain and exposure to elements. I know better, but who would believe my account? I reside in Arizona now, in a desert community where fog is virtually non-existent. Yet on certain nights when the air grows unexpectedly chill, I wake to find condensation on my bedroom windows forming patterns that bear unsettling resemblance to faces. And just at the threshold of hearing, something whispers in a language I almost understand. For those who venture into forests where mist gathers unnaturally, carry light, multiple sources if possible. And if you hear humming or whispers from the vapor, return to open ground immediately. What waits in the mist has existed for centuries, perhaps millennia, and its hunger is patient and enduring. My name is Paul. I've lived in Regina, Saskatchewan all my life, surrounded by endless prairies that stretch toward the horizon like a sea of wheat and grass. The flat landscape can feel isolating, especially in winter when everything freezes over and darkness comes early. I turned 19 last month, in April 2022. At 6'8" and 260 pounds, I've always been the biggest guy in any room. People often assume nothing frightens me because of my size. Most of the time, they're right. Regina might seem unassuming to outsiders, just another Canadian prairie city with modest buildings and wide streets. But like any place with history, it has its secrets. Growing up here, I heard whispers of strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena that people discussed in hushed tones. The indigenous communities in particular maintained rich oral traditions about entities that walked the boundary between our world and something else. As a child, I was fascinated by paranormal accounts. I devoured books about unexplained phenomena, watched documentaries late into the night, and questioned anyone willing to share stories. My parents found my interest amusing, but harmless. "Imagination is healthy for a growing boy," my mother would say, though her expression sometimes betrayed concern when I'd excitedly recount the latest terrifying tale I'd discovered. Despite this lifelong fascination, I never experienced anything truly inexplicable myself, not until I was 16. The event that occurred that summer night changed how I perceive reality. It remains burned into my memory, resurging in nightmares and quiet moments when my guard is down. Winter in Saskatchewan is brutal, but summer brings its own intensity. Long days that stretch past 10 p.m., humid heat that builds toward afternoon thunderstorms, and nights alive with insects. The prairies transform from barren expanses to lush fields teeming with life. The tall grass waves in the breeze like water, concealing whatever might move beneath. What happened to me occurred during one of these summer nights, when the air hung heavy with moisture and distant heat lightning occasionally illuminated the horizon. But to understand why I was where I was and why what I saw affected me so deeply, I need to explain how deeply embedded the local legends had become in my thinking. My freshman year of high school introduced me to Michael, whose family had moved to Regina from Manitoba. Unlike many teenagers who dismissed local folklore as superstition, Michael approached these stories with respectful curiosity. His father worked in cultural preservation at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, giving Michael access to accounts and artifacts most people never encountered. "You can't just dismiss things because they don't fit your worldview," Michael told me once as we walked home from school. Indigenous communities have maintained oral histories for generations. Their knowledge of the land and what lives on it goes deeper than most people understand. We spent countless afternoons in his basement, poring over books and discussing theories about the unexplained. It was Michael who first mentioned the Rougarou to me, not in the context of Louisiana where most associate the legend, but as interpreted by local indigenous communities. "The concept exists across cultures," he explained, "a being that shifts between human and animal form, often as punishment for transgression. The French brought the loup-garou concept, but indigenous communities had their own traditions of shapeshifters long before European contact." I remember leaning forward, captivated. "But what exactly is it supposed to be?" Michael's expression grew serious. "Not what most movies portray. It's not just a man who becomes a wolf under the full moon. It's something that exists in between states, neither fully human nor fully animal. Some accounts describe it as having a human body with a canine head, others as walking upright but moving like an animal." "Have there been sightings around here?" I asked. Michael nodded slowly. "More than you'd think, especially on the outskirts of the city, where development pushes into former wilderness. My dad says reports spike during construction projects that disturb previously untouched land." What fascinated me wasn't just the creature itself, but what it represented: the uncomfortable space between known and unknown, between civilization and wilderness. I didn't know then how personally I would come to understand that liminal terror. The summer before my fateful encounter, I began spending time with Jasmine, whose family lived on a reservation about 40 minutes outside Regina. We met through a community basketball program, where my height made me valuable despite my mediocre coordination. Jasmine possessed a quiet confidence I admired. When conversation among teens turned to local legends, most would laugh or embellish for dramatic effect. Jasmine never did either. She listened, occasionally corrected details, but mostly remained silent during these discussions. One evening after practice, several of us gathered at a local diner. Someone mentioned recent reports of strange howls heard near the city's edge. "Probably just coyotes," Jeremy suggested, reaching for his soda. "They sound weirder than people expect." "Or someone's dog got loose," Ben added with a shrug. I noticed Jasmine's expression change slightly, a subtle tightening around her eyes. Later, as we walked to the bus stop, I asked her about it. "You looked concerned back there. Do you know something about those howls?" She walked several steps before responding. "My grandmother would say that some sounds aren't meant to be heard by human ears. When you hear them, it means boundaries are weakening." "What kind of boundaries?" "Between here and elsewhere." She stopped walking and turned to face me. "Paul, my mother's cousin, saw something last month. She was walking home at dusk, took a shortcut near the western edge of the reservation. There's a stretch of tall grass there that separates the homes from the road." I waited, as Jasmine seemed to consider whether to continue. She said she felt watched first. That's always the first sign. The feeling of eyes following you. Then movement in the grass, but not like wind, more purposeful. She started walking faster, and that's when she heard it breathing. "An animal?" I asked. She thought so at first. Maybe a coyote or stray dog. But the breathing was wrong, too deep, too controlled. When she looked back, she saw something rising from the grass, standing up on two legs, but not like a person would stand. A chill spread across my shoulders, despite the warm evening. "What did she do?" "Ran. Never looked back again. Got home and couldn't speak for an hour, just trembled." Jasmine adjusted her backpack. "My grandmother performed a cleansing ceremony for her. Said the creature didn't follow her home, but it had noticed her. And once these things notice you, they remember." I tried to keep my tone light. "Do you believe it was real? What she saw?" Jasmine's expression remained serious. "I believe she saw something that terrified her. Whether it was what the elders call rougarou or something else, I don't know. But Paul," she touched my arm lightly, "be careful in open spaces at night, especially where the prairie grass grows tall. Some things hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice them. And once you see them, they see you back." Her warning stayed with me, though I didn't heed it as carefully as I should have. Teenagers often feel a sense of invulnerability, especially teenagers my size. The day leading up to my encounter began ordinarily enough. It was late August 2019, with that peculiar quality of late summer light that seems to stretch impossibly as the season wanes. School would resume in 2 weeks, and I was determined to make the most of remaining freedom. I spent the morning helping my father repair our back deck, the wood having warped during the previous winter's harsh freezes. Manual labor came easily to me given my size, though I lacked the precision my father had developed through years of carpentry work. "Hand me that level," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. As I passed it to him, he paused. "Any plans for tonight?" "Going to Jeremy's. Probably play some games, hang out." He nodded approvingly. Jeremy lived in a good neighborhood, and his parents were the attentive type who actually checked in on what we were doing. "Just be home at a reasonable hour. Your mother worries." I agreed without argument. At 16, I'd learned that maintaining my parents' trust afforded me more freedom than pushing boundaries. After finishing with the deck, I showered and texted Jeremy to confirm our plans. Several other friends would be there, Ben, Michael, and a couple guys from the basketball team. We'd planned a marathon gaming session with breaks for pizza and whatever snacks Jeremy's mom would inevitably provide, despite our protests that we could handle our own food. The afternoon passed quickly as I helped my mother with groceries and finished summer reading assignments I'd procrastinated on. Around 6, I grabbed my backpack with a change of clothes, my wireless controller, and a few energy drinks I'd smuggled past my mother's watchful eye. "I'm heading out," I called, already halfway through the door. "Be careful," my mother responded, her typical farewell. "Call if you need anything." I threw my bag over my shoulder and grabbed my bike from the garage. My car was in the shop. Nothing serious, just routine maintenance, so I'd be relying on pedal power. Regina's flat landscape made biking easy, though the distance to Jeremy's house was considerable. I'd done it many times before and thought nothing of the journey home, even knowing it would likely be after midnight when I left. I arrived at Jeremy's house as evening approached. His mother answered the door with her usual warm smile. "Paul, the boys are already downstairs. I've ordered pizza. It should be here in 30 minutes." The basement had been converted into the ultimate teenage hangout. Large TV, gaming consoles, comfortable seating, and a mini fridge Jeremy's parents kept stocked with non-alcoholic options. Michael and Ben were already settled in, controllers in hand, arguing good-naturedly about tournament brackets. "Finally," Ben called as I descended the stairs. "We need a fourth to make this fair." The hours melted away as they often do in good company. We played, ate, talked about girls from school, debated upcoming game releases, and generally existed in that perfect bubble of teenage male camaraderie. No serious concerns, no real-world pressures, just friendship and competition. Around 1 a.m, Jeremy's father came downstairs to remind us of the time. The others were sleeping over, but I hadn't planned to stay. "You sure you don't want to crash here?" Jeremy asked as I gathered my things. "The couch is free." I considered it briefly, but decided against it. "Nah, I promised my mom I'd be home. Besides, I've biked back later than this before." Michael frowned slightly. "It's pretty dark out there." "I've got lights." I patted my backpack where my bike lights were stored. "And unlike you weaklings, I don't fear the night." I flexed dramatically, earning the expected round of groans and insults. If I had listened to that slight hesitation in Michael's voice, perhaps what followed would never have happened. But confidence, some might call it arrogance, is the particular domain of teenage boys who haven't yet learned their limitations. I said my goodbyes and headed upstairs, Jeremy following to lock the door behind me. "Text when you get home," he said, our usual practice when any of us traveled alone at night. "Will do." I secured my backpack, attached my lights to my bike, and pushed off into the darkness, completely unaware that in less than 30 minutes, my understanding of the world would fundamentally change. The night air had cooled considerably, a welcome relief after the day's humidity. Regina's streets were largely deserted, with only occasional cars passing, mostly taxis and late-night workers heading home. The city takes on a different character after midnight. Familiar landmarks cast unusual shadows, and sounds carried differently through the quiet. My route home from Jeremy's house normally took about 30 minutes at a casual pace. I could cut it to 20 if I pushed myself, which I often did during daylight hours. At night, I typically followed the most well-lit streets, even though this added distance. But that night, feeling restless and energetic from the hours of competition, I decided to take the shorter route that would lead me past Wascana Park and down a long, straight road that ran alongside a large open field. The main streets posed no issues. Streetlights illuminated my path, and the rhythm of pedaling lulled me into that meditative state cyclists often experience, mind wandering while body works automatically. I thought about school starting soon, about college applications I would need to prepare in the coming year, about the girl in my chemistry class I hoped would be assigned as my lab partner again. As I turned onto the less populated street that would take me past the park, the darkness intensified. Here, streetlights were spaced farther apart, creating pools of illumination with stretches of shadow between them. To my left stretched Wascana Park, normally a beautiful green space in daylight, now transformed into an impenetrable wall of blackness. To my right stood houses, most with lights off at this hour, their occupants long since retired for the night. I'd traveled this route many times before without incident, but something felt different. The sensation came gradually, an awareness that pricked at the edges of my consciousness, like the moment before thunder when the air seems to hold its breath I found myself glancing repeatedly toward the park, squinting to penetrate the darkness. Nothing moved there, at least nothing I could see. Yet the feeling of being observed intensified with each passing minute. I increased my speed, shifting my bike to a higher gear. The cool air now felt uncomfortably cold against my face as I picked up pace. "Just your imagination," I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice strangely muffled in the night air. "Michael's story's getting to you." But the sensation persisted, that crawling awareness of being tracked, studied. Prey animals must feel this way when predators fixate on them from concealment, I thought. The idea did nothing to comfort me. My eyes strained to monitor my surroundings while still watching the road ahead. The path ran straight for nearly a mile, making it impossible to quickly reach the safety of more populated areas. The rational part of my brain insisted nothing was wrong, that I was allowing stories and darkness to affect my perception. But more primitive instincts, the ancient human fear of being hunted, overrode logic. I pedaled harder, pushing my muscles to increase speed. Wind rushed past my ears, partially drowning out other sounds, which somehow made me more uneasy rather than less. I couldn't hear if something was approaching over the sound of my own movement. That's when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, something keeping pace with me in the park to my left. The darkness made details impossible to discern, but something large was definitely moving parallel to my route, just beyond the reach of the intermittent streetlights. My heart rate, already elevated from exertion, now pounded painfully against my ribs. Fight-or-flight response flooded my system with adrenaline, pushing me to greater speed. I threw the gears into their highest setting and pumped my legs with desperate energy. Whatever moved in the darkness matched my increased pace effortlessly. It stayed carefully within the shadows, never venturing into the spill of light from the street lamps. This deliberate avoidance of illumination struck me as terrifyingly intentional. Not the behavior of an animal operating on instinct, but something with calculation and purpose. The distance to the end of the street seemed to stretch impossibly. Each revolution of my pedals felt like it covered less ground than it should, as though the road itself was extending before me. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air, and my breathing became ragged. What terrified me most wasn't the presence of something tracking me. It was the growing certainty that it was waiting for something, playing with me. It could have overtaken me already if speed was its only objective. The realization sent waves of fresh fear through my body. The intersection that marked the end of this nightmarish stretch finally came into view. A junction where the road met a pedestrian underpass that tunneled beneath railway tracks. Once through that underpass, I'd be back in a well-populated area, just minutes from home. Safety seemed tangibly close. As I approached the intersection, the movement in the park stopped. Through my terror, curiosity compelled me to glance left one final time. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. Standing at the edge of the park, precisely at the boundary where darkness met the weak illumination of the distant streetlight, was a figure. At first glance, its silhouette suggested a large dog or perhaps a wolf, though neither should exist in urban Regina. But as I slowed slightly, my body betraying my mind's command to keep moving, the figure rose. It stood on its hind legs in a motion no natural animal could accomplish. The transformation from quadruped to biped happened with disturbing fluidity, like watching oil pour upward against gravity. What had seemed dog-like in profile now towered at a height that matched or exceeded my own considerable stature. The creature's proportions were wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Its torso approximated a human form, but with shoulders too broad and a waist too narrow. The arms hung unnaturally long, extending well past where knees would be on a human. Each hand, if such appendages could be called hands, terminated in elongated digits tipped with what appeared to be claws that captured and reflected the distant streetlight. Most disturbing was its head, unmistakably canine in structure but larger than any wolf or dog I'd ever seen. The snout protruded with unnatural length, and even at this distance, I could make out teeth visible beyond closed jaws. But it was the eyes that truly horrified me. They caught the meager light and reflected it back as twin points of amber luminescence. Unlike animal eyes that simply reflect light mechanically, these possessed awareness, intelligence that observed and calculated. They fixed on me with predatory focus and something worse, recognition. We regarded each other across the distance for what felt like minutes, but must have been mere seconds. It made no move to approach, yet I felt its attention like a physical weight. Its chest expanded with deep, controlled breathing after the exertion of pacing me. The sound carried across the empty street, a rasping inhalation too deep and resonant for its frame, as though the lungs inside were larger than its exterior suggested possible. The creature's fur appeared matted and coarse, a color that blended perfectly with the dead prairie grass surrounding it. Not the rich brown or gray of healthy wildlife, but a sickly yellowish tan, like vegetation left too long without water. It seemed simultaneously solid and insubstantial, as though it might dissolve back into the landscape that had concealed it. What happened next broke the paralysis that had momentarily overtaken me. The thing tilted its head slightly, a terrifyingly human gesture of curiosity, and took one deliberate step forward. The movement conveyed clear intent, and survival instinct finally overcame my shocked immobility. I wrenched my attention away and pedaled with renewed desperation toward the underpass. My tires squealed against the pavement as I took the turn too quickly, nearly losing control. The darkness of the tunnel loomed before me, and for an instant I hesitated. What if it was waiting there, using the underpass to trap me? No choice remained but forward movement. I plunged into the tunnel, the sound of my breathing and bicycle wheels echoing chaotically off the concrete walls. The distance through the underpass was perhaps 30 meters, but it stretched endlessly before me. Darkness broken only by my bike's front light, casting disturbing, elongated shadows. Halfway through, terror compelled me to look back. The entrance to the tunnel framed a silhouette, the creature standing upright at the mouth of the underpass. It made no move to follow, but watched with that same terrible intentness. The message seemed clear. It could pursue if it wished, but was choosing not to. The boundary, perhaps the proximity to more populated areas beyond, had given it pause. I emerged from the opposite side, gasping for breath, and found myself on familiar streets lined with houses and apartments. Distant traffic sounds provided comfort, the reassuring noise of normal human activity. When I glanced back one final time, the tunnel entrance stood empty. The remaining distance home passed in a blur of frantic pedaling. I ran red lights, cut across lanes without checking for cars, and pushed my speed beyond safety. Nothing mattered except putting distance between myself and what I'd seen. I arrived home drenched in sweat, hands trembling so badly, I struggled to lock my bike in the garage. The house stood dark, except for the porch light my parents always left on when I was out. I fumbled with my keys at the door, dropped them twice before managing to insert them in the lock, and practically fell into the entryway. The normalcy of our family home, the familiar smell of furniture polish my mother used, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the family photos lining the hallway, created a surreal contrast to what I'd just experienced. I stood in the darkened entryway, back pressed against the closed door, struggling to regulate my breathing and organize my thoughts. My phone vibrated in my pocket, Jeremy texting to check if I'd made it home. I pulled it out, stared at the screen without comprehension for several seconds, then managed to type, "Home safe," with shaking fingers. The mundane exchange felt impossibly distant from my current reality. Sleep was out of the question. I moved through the house like a ghost, checking window locks, peeking through blinds at the empty street, starting at every normal house sound. I finally settled on the living room couch, unwilling to go upstairs to my bedroom with its windows overlooking the backyard. I left the TV on with the volume low, needing the comfort of human voices and light. Morning arrived after what felt like years. I must have eventually succumbed to exhaustion because I woke to sunlight streaming through windows and my mother's concerned expression as she stood over me. "Paul, why are you sleeping down here? Are you feeling okay?" I blinked up at her, the previous night's terror momentarily forgotten, then rushing back in a flood of adrenaline. I got in late. Didn't want to wake anyone." She frowned, not believing me but not pushing further. "You're pale. Are you coming down with something?" "Maybe." The excuse was welcome. "Just tired." In daylight, surrounded by normality, doubt began to creep in. Had I actually seen what I thought I saw? The human mind can play extraordinary tricks, especially in darkness, when primed by stories and operating under fatigue. Perhaps it had been a large dog, and my imagination had transformed it into something more sinister. Or maybe someone had been walking their German Shepherd and stopped to watch me pass. The transformation from 4 legs to 2, merely the owner standing up from crouching beside their pet. These rationalizations provided temporary comfort, but couldn't entirely dispel the memory of those eyes watching me with unnatural intelligence, or the wrongness of the proportions as it stood upright. Most disturbing was the purposefulness of its behavior, the precise way it had paced me while remaining hidden, revealing itself only at the boundary where my escape was assured. I spent the day in a fog, moving mechanically through household chores, responding to texts from friends with brief, uninformative replies. My parents exchanged concerned glances, but attributed my behavior to typical teenage moodiness or possible illness. That evening, I researched local wildlife on my laptop. Regina has coyotes in surrounding areas, occasionally venturing into parks, but nothing approaching the size of what I'd seen. Wolves are extremely rare in the region. No bears had been reported near the city in decades. I expanded my search to include cryptid legends and found myself on websites discussing dogman sightings across North America. The descriptions matched disturbingly well with what I'd encountered. The height, the inappropriate proportions, the intelligence in the eyes, the tendency to track targets before revealing themselves. Many accounts mentioned the same yellowish-brown coloration I'd observed. Most disturbing were the maps showing clusters of sightings. While most concentrated in wooded regions of Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Pacific Northwest, a small but significant cluster appeared in the prairie provinces of Canada, particularly near boundaries between developed areas and open grassland. I discovered that around the same time as my encounter, local news had reported several pet disappearances in neighborhoods bordering Wascana Park. The articles attributed the incidents to coyotes or feral dogs, with animal control officials urging residents to keep pets indoors at night. One interview with a distraught pet owner described hearing something large moving through their yard before their dog disappeared without trace. The more I read, the more my certainty grew. What I had seen wasn't imagination or mistaken identity. Something existed in the liminal spaces of Regina, something that most people would never encounter because they didn't venture into those boundary zones at the wrong hours. 3 years have passed since that night. I've never again taken that route after dark, rearranging my entire life to avoid being in certain areas at certain times. My friends noticed the change. How I became adamant about leaving gatherings before sunset, or insisting on driving rather than biking, even in perfect weather. Most attributed it to some undisclosed incident and eventually stopped questioning. Only Michael seemed to understand without explanation. When I finally mentioned having seen something unusual near Wascana Park, he didn't press for details but nodded with somber recognition. "Some things are better left unacknowledged," he said, then added more quietly, "Did it see you?" The question struck me as odd, yet perfectly aligned with my experience. "Yes," I answered. "It definitely saw me." Michael's expression darkened. Be careful then. Recognition goes both ways. I've researched extensively since then, looking for scientific explanations or similar accounts. Zoologists dismiss the possibility of undiscovered large predators in populated areas. Psychologists suggest shared cultural narratives shape perception of ambiguous stimuli, explaining consistent descriptions across separate sightings. Yet neither explanation satisfies me. What I encountered possessed physicality and purpose that transcended hallucination or misidentification. The way it moved, the deliberate nature of its actions, the intelligence evident in its observation, these aspects cannot be dismissed as tricks of light or imagination. I've spoken with Jasmine a few times since then. Without sharing my experience, I asked more about her community's understanding of the Rougarou and similar entities. Our elders say these beings exist in between, not fully of this world or another, she explained. They're drawn to thresholds, to people who walk the edges. Some believe seeing them marks you somehow. Marks you how? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She considered before answering. As someone who has glimpsed beyond normal perception, it creates a connection, an awareness that flows both ways. Her words resonated uncomfortably. Since that night, I've experienced moments of inexplicable unease, sudden certainty of being watched when alone in open spaces, even in broad daylight. Dreams where I'm running along endless prairie paths with something keeping pace just beyond sight. The sensation intensifies near boundaries, where urban development meets natural spaces, where light gives way to darkness. I'm 19 now, preparing for university next fall. I've chosen a campus in Vancouver, as far from the prairies as I can reasonably go while staying in Canada. Perhaps distance will weaken whatever connection was established that night. Perhaps different terrain, different boundaries, will offer protection that familiarity cannot. But in quiet moments, when I'm most honest with myself, I acknowledge the truth. What I saw changed me fundamentally. Not because it revealed monsters exist, but because it revealed the world is not what we pretend it to be. Reality has seams, places where the familiar gives way to something else. Most people move through life never glimpsing these ruptures. I no longer have that luxury. Having seen beyond the veil, I cannot unsee it. And sometimes, in the moment between wakefulness and sleep, I'm overwhelmed by the certainty that something waits patiently for our paths to cross again. Something that remembers me as clearly as I remember it. The prairies hold secrets beneath their seeming emptiness. They conceal watchers in the waving grass. I know this now, and the knowledge itself forms a boundary I can never recross, separating who I was before that night from who I have become since. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The summer of 2011 started with such promise. Several months earlier, during a frigid February evening at our local pub, my group of 4 longtime friends had enthusiastically committed to a July wilderness expedition. In that moment, warmed by beer and camaraderie, the idea of escaping technology and reconnecting with nature seemed perfect. "We need this man," said my friend, the bearded geology enthusiast who first suggested Acadia National Park. No screens, no bosses, just wilderness and whiskey for 3 days. I was immediately captivated by the idea. At 27, I'd spent the last 5 years hunched over keyboards in windowless offices, my outdoor experiences limited to the occasional weekend hike. The prospect of a true wilderness adventure, setting up camp, building fires, navigating trails, filled me with an almost childlike excitement. Over the next few months, I transformed into an outdoor preparation zealot. I spent hours researching gear, reading camping forums, and watching wilderness survival videos. My small apartment gradually filled with equipment, a high-end backpack, waterproof clothing, portable cookware, water purification tablets, and a tent that promised to withstand anything short of a hurricane. The expenditure strained my modest budget, but I justified every purchase as an investment in an unforgettable experience. As July approached, our group chat buzzed with anticipation. We coordinated supplies, planned meals, and shared trail maps. Everything seemed perfectly arranged until the first cancellation came. Sorry guys, the timing's awful, but my sister just announced her engagement party that weekend. Family obligation. This came from our group's most experienced outdoorsman, whose absence immediately diminished our collective wilderness expertise. 3 days later, another friend bowed out, citing an unexpected work deadline. The third cancellation followed within a week, a sudden back injury that made hiking impossible. The final blow came just 4 days before our departure date. My girlfriend surprised me with concert tickets for that weekend, texted my last remaining companion. Paid a fortune for them. I really can't bail. I stared at my phone, surrounded by carefully organized camping supplies in my living room. The disappointment was crushing. Months of planning and hundreds of dollars invested, all seemingly wasted. I considered postponing, but summer in Maine is brief and glorious. By September, the weather would turn unpredictable, and winter follows quickly. That night, as I half-heartedly packed away my gear, a realization struck me. Nothing was actually preventing me from going alone. I was healthy, prepared, and the campsite reservation remained valid. The more I considered it, the more appealing the idea became. Complete solitude, a true test of self-reliance, the kind of experience that shapes a person. My decision made, I revised my plans for solo travel, adjusted my supplies, and informed a neighbor of my itinerary for safety. Little did I know that my independent adventure would transform from a peaceful communion with nature into something far more disturbing. The 3-hour drive to Acadia National Park passed quickly, my anticipation building with each mile. The park's reputation for breathtaking coastal landscapes and pristine wilderness was well earned, judging by the glimpses I caught as I approached Mount Desert Island. The morning sun illuminated granite peaks rising above dense forests, while glimpses of the Atlantic sparkled between the trees. After checking in at the ranger station and collecting my backcountry permit, I parked at the designated trailhead. The weight of my pack as I hoisted it onto my shoulders felt reassuring rather than burdensome. Everything I needed for survival contained in one carefully organized bundle. The first miles of hiking were pure joy. July in Maine offered perfect conditions, temperatures in the high 70s, low humidity, and just enough breeze to keep insects at bay. The trail alternated between dense woodland and occasional clearings that revealed spectacular views of the rugged coastline below. "This is exactly what I needed," I said aloud to no one, my voice barely audible over the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail. The absence of my friends, which had seemed so disappointing days earlier, now felt like an unexpected gift. The solitude allowed me to move at my own pace, stop whenever something caught my interest, and fully absorb my surroundings without conversation to distract me. By mid-afternoon, I reached my designated camping area, a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the nearest marked trail, surrounded by towering pines and thick undergrowth. The location offered both privacy and protection from coastal winds, with a small natural spring nearby for water. Setting up camp alone proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. Tasks that would have been divided among 4 people now fell entirely to me. I methodically cleared the ground of rocks and debris, pitched my tent, organized my supplies, and gathered firewood, all while keeping an eye on the descending sun. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of the profound quiet. Not silence exactly. The forest was alive with sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant murmur of water, but an absence of human noise. No cars, no voices, no mechanical hums. This isolation, while initially peaceful, gradually took on a slightly unsettling quality as shadows lengthened across my campsite. By the time I finished setting up camp and preparing a simple dinner over my portable stove, Darkness had nearly fallen. I established a small fire in the designated ring, more for comfort than necessity in the mild July evening. The dancing flames provided both light and a psychological barrier against the darkness that now enveloped the forest around me. That first night alone in the wilderness revealed sensitivities I hadn't known I possessed. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush commanded my immediate attention. The rational part of my mind recognized these as normal forest sounds, small animals foraging, wind moving through branches, but some primal instinct kept me vigilantly alert. Sleep came in restless intervals, my dreams filled with vague pursuers and labyrinthine forests. I woke frequently, each time needing a moment to reorient myself to my surroundings. When dawn finally arrived, it brought both relief and renewed enthusiasm for the day ahead. My second day in Acadia followed a more confident rhythm. I woke early, prepared a breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong coffee, and spent the morning exploring the area surrounding my campsite. The discomfort of the previous night faded in daylight, replaced by growing self-assurance in my wilderness capabilities. I discovered a small ridge about a half-mile from camp that offered spectacular views of the Atlantic stretching to the horizon. Sitting there, notebook in hand, I sketched crude but enthusiastic renderings of the landscape and wrote detailed observations about the environment. The simple act of documenting my experience grounded me in the present moment, creating a deeper connection to my surroundings. That afternoon, I hiked to a nearby trail junction where, according to my map, I could access a secluded beach. The descent to the shore was steep and challenging, but the reward was worth the effort, a crescent of smooth pebbles and coarse sand, empty of other visitors, despite the perfect weather. I spent hours there, wading in the frigid water, examining tide pools, and collecting uniquely shaped stones as souvenirs. Returning to camp before sunset, I felt a growing sense of competence. I had successfully navigated unmarked terrain, found water sources, maintained my campsite, and prepared meals, all without assistance. This self-reliance was intoxicating, transforming my initial disappointment about my friend's absence into genuine gratitude for the solitary experience. The second night brought easier sleep. The forest sounds that had seemed so alarming before now formed a familiar backdrop, almost soothing in their consistency. I still woke occasionally, but without the jarring disorientation of the first night. By the third day, I'd established comfortable routines, morning hikes, afternoon relaxation, careful preparation for nightfall. I'd learned to anticipate the forest's rhythms, when birds would crescendo their calls, when small mammals would become active, how shadows would shift as the sun moved overhead. This growing familiarity fostered a false sense of control, a dangerous assumption that I understood my environment and the potential threats within it. That afternoon, I spent several hours carefully constructing additional bear alarms, simple tripwires attached to suspended metal items that would create noise if disturbed. Though black bears rarely posed significant threats to campers, especially those practicing proper food storage, the precaution seemed prudent given my solitude. I placed these alarms along likely approach paths to my campsite, creating an invisible perimeter that would alert me to large animals or people approaching after dark. As the sun began to set on my third day in the wilderness, I felt settled and secure. I'd conquered initial fears, established functioning systems, and grown comfortable with my temporary home. This confidence would prove tragically misplaced as night fell and brought with it an encounter that would shatter my newfound comfort and leave lasting psychological wounds. That evening began like the previous two. I prepared a simple dinner as daylight faded, secured my food supplies in a bear-resistant container, and built a modest fire. The night air carried a slight chill that hadn't been present before, suggesting the approach of a weather system from the north. I pulled on a fleece jacket and sat beside the flames, listening to the gradual transition from daytime forest sounds to the nocturnal symphony of insects and distant owls. Around 10 o'clock, I extinguished the fire properly and retreated to my tent. Sleep came quickly after the day's physical activities, and I drifted into unconsciousness, unaware of the disturbance that awaited me. I woke suddenly around what must have been midnight or early morning, my body signaling an urgent biological need. For 3 days, I'd been avoiding a certain natural function, intimidated by the prospect of wilderness bathroom procedures. The discomfort had finally reached an unavoidable threshold. Grimacing, I fumbled for my headlamp, adjusting it to its dimmest blue light setting to preserve my night vision. The soft glow illuminated the condensation-covered walls of my tent. The sleeping bag tangled around my legs, and the organized rows of equipment alongside me. Outside, the forest was unnaturally quiet, lacking even the usual insect sounds, a stillness that should have registered as a warning. I pulled on my boots without bothering to lace them properly, grabbed a roll of biodegradable toilet paper and a small trowel, and unzipped my tent with deliberate slowness to minimize noise. The night air hit me with unexpected coldness, causing an involuntary shiver. Above, through gaps in the canopy, stars shone with remarkable brightness, the moon having already set. Standing motionless outside my tent, I listened intently, scanning the darkness beyond the meager blue glow of my headlamp. Nothing moved, nothing called. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, which I rationalized as a normal lull in nocturnal activity, rather than the reaction of wildlife to human intruders. I moved away from camp with careful steps, conscious of both noise and the increasing urgency of my mission. The forest floor was a treacherous maze of exposed roots, fallen branches, and uneven terrain, requiring my complete attention despite the distraction of physical discomfort. After walking perhaps 100 yards from camp, I found a suitable location, a small clearing with a fallen tree that could provide support. What followed was awkward but mercifully quick, the practical realities of wilderness living temporarily overriding any squeamishness. I completed the necessary task, buried the evidence as wilderness ethics required, and prepared to return to camp with considerable relief. It was precisely at this moment of vulnerability, pants just fastened, supplies being gathered, thoughts already drifting toward the comfort of my sleeping bag, that I noticed the distant beam of light cutting through the forest in the direction of my campsite. My reaction was instinctive and immediate. I switched off my headlamp and dropped to a crouching position, suddenly acutely aware of my vulnerability. The distant light swung in deliberate patterns, illuminating sections of the forest with methodical precision. This was not the erratic movement of a lost hiker's desperate search, but the calculated examination of someone looking for something, or someone, specific. Heart hammering against my ribs, I remained frozen in place, afraid that any movement might create noise in the unnaturally silent forest. Questions raced through my mind. Who would be in this remote section of the park at this hour? Why would they approach an occupied campsite without announcing themselves? How had they bypassed my carefully placed alarm systems? The most disturbing possibility, that their presence coincided precisely with my brief absence from camp, suggested observation. Had someone been watching me? For how long? Rather than returning directly to camp, I began a cautious, circuitous approach, keeping to the densest shadows and testing each footstep before committing my weight. As I drew closer, moving from tree to tree for cover, a second light appeared beside the first, confirming my worst fears. There were at least 2 intruders. From my concealed position approximately 80 feet from camp, I could now make out silhouettes against the ambient starlight, 2 figures of substantial build, both male, judging by their height and movement patterns. Their flashlights played over my tent, my cooking equipment, my carefully arranged firewood. One figure bent to examine something on the ground, while the other continued to sweep the surrounding forest with his light. Neither spoke for several minutes, their silence more unnerving than any conversation might have been. When one finally broke the quiet, His voice carried clearly in the still night air. "Someone's definitely staying here," he said, voice low but not whispered. "Pretty elaborate setup for a solo camper." The second figure straightened from his examination of whatever had caught his interest near my tent. He was just here, sleeping bag still warm. Those words, "he was just here," sent a wave of nausea through my body. They knew I was alone. They had been close enough to touch my sleeping bag. They had been watching, waiting for me to leave. "Should we wait?" the first man asked, his flashlight beam now directed at the surrounding forest, sweeping dangerously close to my position. The second man considered for a moment before responding. "No, too risky with daylight coming in a few hours. We'll just come back tomorrow. He's not going anywhere." That last statement, delivered with such casual certainty, carried implications that turned my blood to ice water. There was expectation in his voice, anticipation. Whatever their intentions, they assumed they would have another opportunity. They believed I would remain unaware of their nocturnal visit, vulnerable to their return. A brief, unintelligible exchange followed before both figures turned away from my camp and moved off in the direction from which they had apparently come. Their lights remained visible through the trees for several minutes before finally disappearing, leaving me alone in the profound darkness. Even after the lights vanished, I remained completely still, afraid that any movement might reveal my position to watchers I could no longer see. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I maintained my uncomfortable crouch behind the broad trunk of an ancient pine, muscles cramping and extremities gradually numbing in the cool night air. My mind raced through scenarios, each more disturbing than the last. Were they poachers mistaking me for a game warden? Thieves targeting camping equipment? Or something more sinister? Predators who deliberately sought isolated victims in remote locations? The methodical nature of their search and their obvious comfort moving through dense forest at night suggested experience and planning rather than opportunistic crime. The realization that they had disabled or bypassed my warning systems without triggering a single alarm deepened my dread. These were not casual hikers who had stumbled upon my camp. They had approached with deliberate stealth, knowing exactly how to move undetected. After what my watch confirmed was only 20 minutes, though it felt immeasurably longer, I began to contemplate my options. Remaining in my current position until dawn would leave me exposed to the dropping temperature, potentially compromising my physical condition. Returning to camp meant warmth and equipment, but also the possibility of walking into an ambush if the intruders had doubled back. The third option, immediate evacuation, seemed most prudent, but presented considerable dangers of its own. Navigating unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness, carrying hastily gathered equipment, while potentially being pursued by individuals who knew the area better than I did, carried significant risks. I ultimately decided to maintain my position until I could be reasonably certain the intruders had truly departed, then return to camp only long enough to gather essential items before retreating to the ranger station at first light. The hours that followed were an exercise in sustained terror and physical endurance. Every distant sound, a falling branch, an animal's movement, the whisper of wind through leaves, triggered surges of adrenaline. I imagined footsteps circling back, flashlight beams suddenly illuminating my hiding place, rough hands emerging from the darkness. To maintain sanity, I focused on cataloging concrete details of the intruders that I could report. Approximate heights, both over 6 feet. Build, athletic, not bulky. Clothing, dark, practical outdoor gear. Voices, local accents, measured tones, comfortable with each other. This mental exercise provided structure amid mounting panic and helped preserve information that might later prove valuable. As the night progressed, physical discomfort became increasingly difficult to ignore. My limbs alternated between numbness and painful tingling as circulation was compromised by my static position. The temperature continued to drop, and my light clothing, appropriate for a brief excursion from a warm sleeping bag but inadequate for hours of exposure, provided minimal protection. Thirst grew from annoyance to torment. Most challenging was the psychological strain of sustained vigilance, the constant expectation of discovery that never allowed even momentary relaxation. Around 4 in the morning, the forest began to stir with pre-dawn activity. Birds offered tentative calls that gradually increased in frequency and variety. The quality of darkness shifted subtly, not yet approaching light, but losing its absolute opacity. With these changes came a marginal reduction in fear, whatever the intruder's intentions. They had emphasized the risks of daylight, suggesting they preferred to operate under complete darkness. As the first gray light filtered through the canopy, I finally permitted myself to move from my hiding place. My body protested violently, muscles seizing, joints cracking, extremities prickling painfully as circulation returned. I stumbled initially, catching myself against tree trunks until basic coordination returned. Moving with deliberate caution, I approached my campsite from an unexpected angle, pausing frequently to listen and observe before continuing. The camp appeared undisturbed since the intruder's departure, tent still standing, equipment in place, no obvious signs of tampering or sabotage. Despite this apparent normality, entering the clearing required tremendous psychological effort. Every instinct warned against exposing myself in a space where I had been targeted, against touching items that unknown hands had examined hours earlier. Only the urgent need to evacuate before my visitors could return provided sufficient motivation to overcome this resistance. I packed with unprecedented efficiency, abandoning any item not essential for the hike out. My carefully organized systems were discarded in favor of speed, resulting in a chaotic but functional collection of critical gear. The tent, too bulky and time-consuming to properly dismantle, I simply collapsed and roughly stuffed into its bag, accepting the potential damage to poles and fabric as an acceptable cost of rapid departure. Within 15 minutes, all necessary items were secured in my pack. I performed a final sweep of the area, removing anything that might identify me specifically, then consulted my map to plan an evacuation route. Rather than retracing my arrival path along established trails, I plotted a more direct but challenging cross-country route that would minimize my time in the wilderness while avoiding areas where the intruders might anticipate my movement. The morning hike was a punishing test of endurance after a sleepless night. I moved at the fastest sustainable pace across difficult terrain, constantly fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. My chosen route led through dense underbrush, across rocky slopes, and along the edges of wetlands, difficult navigation that I hoped would discourage or confuse potential pursuers. Twice I detected sounds that might have indicated human movement behind me, a displaced stone, a disturbed branch. But whether these represented actual pursuit or merely the product of an overwrought imagination, I couldn't determine. Each incident prompted brief periods of concealment followed by changes in direction, extending my journey but potentially confusing any tracking effort. By mid-morning, the forest began to thin, and I encountered the first signs of regular human presence: a maintained trail, recently trimmed vegetation, directional markers. These indicators of civilization provided surprising emotional relief, though I maintained vigilance and avoided other hikers who occasionally appeared in the distance. Around 11 o'clock, I finally emerged from the forest into the ranger station parking area where my car waited, appearing exactly as I had left it 3 days earlier. This ordinary sight, my unremarkable sedan sitting on gravel amid other vehicles, triggered an overwhelming wave of relief that momentarily weakened my knees. Inside the ranger station, my disheveled appearance and obvious agitation immediately attracted attention. A senior ranger, a weathered woman in her 50s with calloused hands and evaluating eyes, separated me from the tourists checking trail maps and led me to a private office where I could provide a detailed report. "You say they knew you were alone?" she asked after I had recounted the night's events, her expression serious, but not dismissive. That's particularly concerning. I nodded, grateful for her professional response. One specifically mentioned my solo camper setup, and they seemed to know I'd just left camp momentarily. They talked about coming back the next day like they had some kind of plan. The ranger made detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about locations, timing, and descriptions. She seemed particularly interested in my mention of the disabled alarm systems, requesting specific information about their placement and design. We've had reports of equipment theft in the backcountry this season, she explained, but the methodical approach you're describing is different from the opportunistic incidents we've documented. The fact that they showed no interest in taking easily portable gear while you were absent suggests different motivations. She initiated immediate action, dispatching patrol rangers to my former campsite, issuing alerts to all park personnel, and filing a formal report with both park law enforcement and the county sheriff's department. I provided contact information for follow-up and received assurances that the incident would be thoroughly investigated. Despite these professional responses, I detected an undercurrent of limited expectations in the ranger's manner. The vast wilderness, the hours elapsed since the encounter, and the minimal description I could provide all suggested that identifying the intruders was unlikely. Before leaving, I asked the question that had been haunting me. Do you think they were just looking to steal gear, or was it something else? The ranger considered her response carefully. Without making assumptions, I'll say this. Their behavior, targeting an isolated camper, conducting surveillance, planning a return, demonstrates concerning predatory patterns regardless of their specific intentions. This assessment, while diplomatically phrased, confirmed my worst fears. Whatever their ultimate goal, the systematic targeting of a vulnerable individual reflected predatory intent that transcended simple theft. The drive home passed in a blur of exhaustion and residual fear. I repeatedly checked my rearview mirror, irrationally concerned that I was being followed despite the considerable distance from the park. Upon reaching my apartment, I engaged in compulsive security checks, testing window locks, wedging a chair under the doorknob, keeping lights on throughout the night. In the days that followed, I received a follow-up call from park law enforcement confirming that rangers had found my former campsite, but discovered no evidence that could identify the intruders. They had increased patrols in the area and issued warnings to other backcountry campers, but had no suspects or leads to pursue. The psychological impact lingered long after the physical exhaustion faded. Dreams of being watched, pursued through endless forests, or returning to my tent to find unknown figures waiting inside became regular nighttime visitors. Ordinary activities, walking alone at night, hearing unexpected sounds in my apartment, encountering strangers in isolated settings, triggered disproportionate anxiety responses. More fundamentally, the experience altered my relationship with wilderness. The forests that had once represented freedom and self-discovery now evoked complex emotional responses, still beautiful and compelling, but layered with awareness of vulnerability, a recognition that remote places could conceal human predators as effectively as natural ones. 3 years would pass before I attempted another overnight outdoor excursion, and even then, I selected a popular, well-trafficked campground rather than a backcountry site. I never again camped alone, insisted on comprehensive communication equipment when venturing into remote areas, and developed elaborate security protocols that companions sometimes found excessive, but I considered essential. The ranger's final words during our follow-up conversation remained with me. The wilderness itself isn't malevolent or benevolent. It's simply indifferent. The real danger lies in forgetting that human predators, like natural ones, recognize and exploit vulnerability. Awareness isn't paranoia, it's adaptation. I adapted, continuing to seek experiences in wild places but carrying with me the knowledge gained during that long night in Acadia. That darkness conceals, distance isolates, and in remote places the most dangerous predators rarely announce their approach.